This is Transformation Ground Control, your source for all things business, technology, strategy, and change. If you're growing your business, leading change within your organization, or undertaking any sort of operational or technology change initiative, this podcast is for you. This show covers what you need to know about digital transformation, organizational change, operational improvement, and business growth.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
And now, here's your host, Eric Kimberling.
Hello and welcome to Transformation Ground Control, the podcast that covers business, technology, strategy, change, anything you need to know for your transformation initiative. I'm here with Paresa Noble, our co-host. Paresa, welcome back to the show.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. And exciting episode today. We're going to cover a few different topics. We have a number of guests, as we did last time. We have the guest, Marcus Harris is our first guest. He is an attorney who, on the surface, that may sound like a bad idea to have an attorney on a podcast like this, but he's actually not only a smart guy, very entertaining guy, and interesting person to talk to. He's going to talk about contract negotiations and just some of the pitfalls and nuances of things that you should be aware of as you look to new technology and as you potentially hire outside consultants for your transformation. So we're going to have Marcus on the show in our first segment. And then we're also going to have James Hayward, who I'm really excited to have on the show. He's the CFO of a client of ours, Jane's Defense Weekly, a company in the UK that is a client of ours. We're going to talk about some of the challenges and lessons learned from his transformation that he went through with us at Jane's Defense Weekly. And then last but not least, we also have Adam Cheatham, who is the Director of Strategy and Transformation at Third Stage Consulting. And he's going to talk a bit about global transformations and some of the things to be thinking about if you're a multinational organization. And even if you're not a multinational organization, by the way, there's a lot of things he covers and that we will talk about in that interview that will be relevant to anyone going through a transformation, but especially if you're a bigger company, more complex, more global company. So that'll be an exciting discussion to look forward to. And so this is our episode number 2, and it's exciting to kind of work the rust out and work the kinks out in the first episode and look to ways to improve. And one thing I didn't note in the first episode is just really the whole purpose or where the name Ground Control came from. And, for those that have followed me for some time, you know that Third Stage is named after a rock and roll album from the band Boston. My previous company was named after an album from the Cars from the 80s. And Ground Control is actually a reference to David Bowie. And he's got a song out from I think it was in the late 60s or right around 1970, somewhere in there. Just before I was born, that song came out called Space Oddity. And it's the song, if you're a rock and roll connoisseur, it's the song that says Major Tom to Ground Control. It's the whole song about Major Tom going up into space, and he becomes a celebrity, but then they lose contact with him while he's up in space. And it kind of leaves you hanging as to what actually happened to Major Tom. And the reason I like that is because not only is it a space analogy that ties to Third Stage, and Third Stage is also, in addition to being a rock and roll reference, is also a reference to a space analogy. And Ground Control kind of continues with that space theme and the rock and roll theme to go along with it. And I also like it too because it's kind of like when you're going through these transformations, you can feel alone sometimes. You can kind of feel like you're a fish out of water, so to speak, and you're kind of fumbling your way through it and making mistakes along the way. And so really Ground Control is meant to be sort of the think tank or the lessons learned that hopefully will help you and your teams go through the transformation. And if you happen to like classic rock and David Bowie, you can also take comfort in knowing there's a rock and roll connection there too. So that's the whole story behind Ground Control. And because I didn't make fun of your age enough last time, Paresa, I figured I'd start off by saying I know you're too young to know David Bowie, but apparently you've heard of David Bowie, right?
I know him, but I have to say I've gotten to know him a little bit more after partnering up and starting to work with Third Stage. We definitely like music over here, so something I can appreciate.
Yes, and I know you're a music fan and a musician yourself too. So I know you've got a deep appreciation for music, even probably arguably even more so than I do.
Yeah, yep. I do love music. I'm more in I would say like the soul, jazzy blues space, though. That's my vibe. But I do love rock and roll. You know who really loves rock and roll is my 2-year-old who is obsessed with Iron Man. And we wake up to like Black Sabbath and AC/DC every day now, which is great.
It's great. You're going to have your hands full with
I know.
if he's starting at that young of an age. He's already a rocker.
Already a rocker.
That's funny. That Brian Potts, who is a managing partner at Third Stage, he was a guest on our show last week. He has a young daughter as well, and he'll send me videos at times, video clips of his daughter just dancing to AC/DC or Kiss.
Awesome.
I think the last one he sent me was her cranking up a Kiss song, and then she starts dancing to it. It's just fascinating how kids can get into rock and roll at such a young age nowadays.
Hey, it's good stuff. It's good stuff.
It is. So we'll have to have you at some point. When we've got a bigger budget for the show, maybe we could have you perform for us or something. And I don't know if we can afford you right now, but
oh yeah, you got it. We'll put on a show, an exclusive show.
Yeah,
for our listeners.
Yeah, good deal. Well, so one thing before we get to our first guest, which is going to be Marcus Harris, one thing that we really want to do in the show is be interactive and to take audience comments and questions and really have sort of a discussion, not just what you and I want to talk about and asking our guest questions, but taking questions and comments from the audience. And myself and the Third Stage team, we put out a lot of content on social media. LinkedIn in particular is sort of the between LinkedIn and YouTube, those are the two main social media platforms we use. But we're also on Twitter and Facebook and some of the usual places. But LinkedIn in particular is a great place to start a discussion. And I know we've started some discussions recently that you found interesting. And maybe what I thought we'd do is start, before we get to our first guest, maybe start with some of the observations you've had or some of the threads that you've observed on LinkedIn here recently.
Yeah, for sure. So I want to go ahead and dive in with an interesting conversation that you had with your network on a recent LinkedIn post. I think it was about a week ago, where you posed the question of whether or not digital transformation is just another buzzword for ERP. And if so, does it mask the problems that so many ERP projects seem to have? And I thought that responses were super interesting because, in my role, I'm writing a lot about digital transformation as it pertains to ERP systems, implementing new software, whether it's CRM, HCM. But I never really took a step back to see the relationship between the two. And I think Steve Ingram commented on it and said it in a great way. He said, digital transformation is the current process or business process re-engineering. Every few years, a new one comes along, and ultimately it's about the why you do something, not the what you do. So I think in this question that you asked, ERP in this scenario would be the what are you doing? And it kind of falls under this blanket term of digital transformation, which may seem a little bit more appealing, maybe a little bit sexier, rather than just calling it, an ERP implementation. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's an interesting comment that Steve has. And first of all, just for our audience that may not know what ERP means, it's enterprise resource planning, and it's a sort of software that small businesses, mid-sized companies, and even larger organizations use to really provide a single system to tie together all their operations for the most part. Now, that's a very simplistic, perhaps oversimplistic definition of what ERP is, but in the question we're asking, we were kind of honing in on ERP technology in general. And so, lately the word digital transformation, to your point, has become a big buzzword, and it's almost like it's such a big buzzword that I think a lot of people are using it interchangeably with ERP and with other sorts of technology, whether you're talking about, financial systems or human capital management or, business intelligence, whatever it may be. A lot of times companies will just interchange the type of technology with the word digital transformation. And I think that, interesting thing about Steve's comment is that he comments on business process, which is sort of the focal point in his definition and in the way he is suggesting that we think about digital transformation. And I totally agree with that, because I think too often companies will lead with the digital part of the word, or of the phrase digital transformation. And really it's more, in my mind, I viewed it more as just transformation. You're changing your business. It's probably going to involve technology, but that's certainly not the only piece, and it's arguably not even the most important part of it. You've also got the operations and the business process piece of it, but then you also have the organizational and the people side of it. So how are you going to change your employees and change the way they behave and work and their roles and responsibilities every day? So I think it's a subtle difference, but I think it's a nuance. It's worth noting that just because you put a name digital transformation on it doesn't make it any more or less likely to succeed. And you still don't want to overemphasize the technology piece of it.
Right. I mean, because show me a business that doesn't operate using some type of technology, right? Like if you're doing or touching or altering your technology, any point of it, that falls under a digital transformation. And it's way bigger than just changing the technology. It's changing the culture, the way you operate. It's kind of that whole transformation piece, whether it is just an ERP system, right? I say just an ERP system, that's a pretty big system, but it doesn't matter what you're doing, whether you're doing cybersecurity. I think Mark Corker mentioned, it entails your cybersecurity strategy, e-commerce optimizations, everything from robotics to AI. It's a huge terrain, I guess you could say, of making adjustments and really changing how you operate. It's a business transformation.
It really is, yeah. And that's, back to the purpose of this podcast and this show. When you and I were sharing notes and putting together our thoughts on what this podcast should be and what the themes and the trends or the topic should be, we made the conscious decision to not just focus on digital transformation or technology, but to focus on business transformation in general, which obviously oftentimes includes technology, but there's a lot more to it. And you mentioned culture, which is a huge part of it that a lot of times companies overlook.
That's right. And I'm excited to, kind of hear more from our interviewees today, because I think, there's a lot of overlap in what they'll be talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we get to Marcus Harris here in a second, he in particular, his discussion and some of the things I'll ask him is largely focused on companies that are engaging in a contract for software or technology, as well as the services that go along with that. So I don't want to be dismissive of the idea of technology, because it certainly is an important part of what drives business transformation. But to your point about culture and Steve's point about business process and operations, those are the things that are really going to enable improvements to the business. The technology helps, of course, but the technology doesn't matter if you can't fix or address the people and process side of it as well.
That's right. You said it well.
Yeah. Well, good. So that's a sort of a high level definition of transformation. I'd be curious to hear the audience's thoughts here. And by the way, we are encouraging you to follow myself and follow Third Stage on LinkedIn and be a part of the conversation. I'd love to hear your feedback, and Paresa and I will be pulling content or pulling comments and questions from social media to talk about and really unpack and bring to life on this show. So be sure to follow us there on LinkedIn, and you can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and of course YouTube as well. YouTube, we put out content, 2 to 3 videos a week between myself and the Third Stage channel. So I encourage everyone to follow us there as well. So we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll open up the conversation with Marcus Harris, and we'll talk about contract negotiations and really how to set yourself up for success as you bring in technology and or service providers to help you with your transformation initiatives. So we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more on the Ground Control podcast.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Okay, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control Podcast. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm here with Paresa Noble. Thank you for being here today. And what I wanted to do before we get to our first guest is just to remind you to please subscribe to the YouTube channel, follow Third Stage, and follow myself on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, whatever your social media platform of choice is. You can also subscribe to this podcast in audio formats on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, Pandora, whatever your podcast preference of choice is. And so we publish these weekly podcasts once a week. Every Wednesday morning, U.S. time, is when we go live on YouTube with the broadcast. And then we also have distribution to the podcast platform shortly after that. So I encourage you to be sure to subscribe on whatever platform you prefer to watch or listen to us on. So next guest here, our first guest, I should say, is Marcus Harris. He's going to talk about contract negotiations. And contract negotiations is one of those things when, especially if you're buying or acquiring new technology for your business, if it's financial or accounting software or enterprise software, human capital software, whatever that may be, CRM, Salesforce, all those sorts of different technologies you might be acquiring for your business. There's a lot of hiccups and gotchas that you want to watch for, and that's what Marcus Harris specializes in. So we thought we'd pick his brain a little bit and ask some questions around best practices and lessons from his experience helping clients negotiate contracts. And in some cases, he also will help when there's a lawsuit involved too. And that's actually how I got to know Marcus. I testified as an expert in one of his cases several years ago as an expert witness. And we've continued to work together over the years on multiple cases, and he continues to be a friend of Third Stage Consulting. We work very closely together on a number of engagements through the years. So with all that being said, I want to welcome Marcus to the show. Marcus, thanks for being here today.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, Eric. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Good. So as companies are thinking about their contract negotiations and getting ready for the acquisition of new software and the services that go along with that, there's a lot to think about. A lot of times we hear from clients that their heads are spinning in terms of the number of things they need to think about, or maybe not necessarily understanding the details or the T's and C's of the different contracts they're signing. But from your perspective, since you do this every day, this is what you specialize in terms of negotiating contracts and helping your clients negotiate contracts. If you were to summarize for listeners today, why is effective contract negotiations so important?
Well, I mean, I think the way that I look at it really is it's an opportunity for you to come to some sort of a meeting of the minds with respect to what your expectations are or how that project is going to be going. Who's responsible for what aspect of that project. And it really is part and parcel, in my view, to having an effective contract or not necessarily contract management process put in place, but an effective project management process. So contract management is certainly one thing and one aspect of the contract negotiation in itself. But I think fundamentally, you want to approach the contract negotiation process as a means for being able to manage your relationship with that vendor for really, the duration of the project and potentially beyond the duration of the project, depending on what kinds of services you're going to on an ongoing basis. So it really is an opportunity that you need to take advantage of. And I think you've got to look at it from at least two perspectives. One, I think, I'm an attorney, so I'm going to recommend that you look at it from a legal perspective, and it's a contract with terms and conditions. So you're kind of forced to look at it from that perspective. But if that's the only way you're looking at it, I think it really is a missed opportunity because, like I said, fundamentally, it's one of the only chances that you're going to get on the front end to be able to put in place a process for managing your relationship with the vendor. And that's incredibly important.
Right, right. So along those lines, then, when you're helping your clients through this process and you're either leading the negotiations or advising your clients on how to negotiate with vendors, what are some of the biggest pitfalls or traps that you see your clients walk into or they have the potential to walk into during the whole process?
Yeah, I think there's really two answers to that question. I think from a client perspective, where I think clients make a huge mistake is really focusing on the amount of the discount that they're going to try to negotiate. So, it's that's certainly an important aspect of the negotiation process. What are you going to get out of this fundamentally, right? I want to get the best deal that I can get, but if you're just focused on the amount of discount you're getting off of list or the pricing structure of the contract, you're really missing out on an opportunity. And I think what you want to do is use, again, the contract as a tool for putting in place a process for managing your relationship with the vendor. And it takes a variety of flavors. I mean, there's a change management process that you can negotiate. You're also going to want to see if you can put in place, especially in this environment, some kind of dispute resolution process that is short of a litigation process and maybe even short of arbitration. So that's one area where I think clients make a mistake is focusing on price to the exclusion of everything else. And I think if that's the way you go about it, you're missing an opportunity to negotiate things in that contract that will impact price much more than any kind of an initial discount that you might be able to negotiate. The other way I look at that question and a common pitfall is, to some extent, it's more of a T's and C's issue. I think if you're focusing primarily on kinds of these kind of abstract legal concepts that are certainly important. Look, getting a warranty and non-infringement, service warranties with respect to performance, those are all key issues that you want to negotiate. But sometimes I think you can negotiate and focus on those to the exclusion of some of the practical things that might matter that are in a contract. And that's where having really experienced counsel that understands, not only the legal terms and conditions, but how these things play out from a practical perspective in real life. One example would be, negotiating a limitation of liability is, like I said, it's important. But, depending on the value of the entire deal, you're going to want to take a different approach to that. And, having, some kind of multiplier of the limitation of liability on something that's a project that's low in dollars, that may or may not make sense. It just depends on how that really is going to play out, what type of functionalities being implemented, and what the risk is, and what the relative position from a negotiation standpoint or a leverage standpoint of the two parties is.
Right. Yeah, and I want to come back to something you mentioned around negotiating not just with software vendors, but there's also more the services side. You talked about change management, things like that. So I want to come back to that in a second. I have a follow-up question for you there. But I guess just sticking with the software vendor side of things, if we think about this as sort of a two-pronged negotiation approach, typically where you're negotiating the software and then you're negotiating the services to go with it. When we think about the trend towards cloud and more subscription-based pricing and subscription-based models, what are some of the nuances to watch for there? How is that different than negotiating what we might have negotiated in the past with our on-premise sorts of contracts?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two things that jump to the forefront, really, when you're talking about the difference between on-premise contracts and subscription-based contracts. And I think fundamentally, when you're getting into a subscription-based contract, you're going to want to understand the process by which you can get out of that contract, okay? Because the vendor's goal is a little bit different. They want to have automatic renewals. They want to have automatic price increases. And your goal as a customer is really to have the most flexibility that you can, but you also have to understand that to the extent that you're getting into that kind of a deal, a subscription-based deal, the discount is going to be to some extent directly tied to how long that deal is. So the vendor wants to sign you up for as long as it can, with as little flexibility as they can give you, whereas you have the opposite goal and you want to have, short time commitments with maximum flexibility to get out and adopt a new system and replace that system. So that's one thing. And I think one of the other things that comes to mind, really, it's all about data, right? In an on-premise solution, it's a perpetual license that to software that's going to be primarily located on site on servers, in your building. And just to a large extent, I mean, your IT department's going to be responsible for managing and maintaining that data and accessing, personally identifiable information of your customer base and your employees as well. When it's in the cloud, it's really a whole different environment, and you really want to understand how your data is handled by whatever vendor you're talking about. Is it bundled with other companies' data? What kind of data protections do they have? What about some sort of data breach or data incident? How is that going to be handled, and who's going to be responsible for it? And what kind of limitation of liability is going to be subject to? Because you want to make sure that if something like that happens with your data, that you've got real remedies under the contract to make you whole. So it's substantively different in certain ways. I mean, fundamentally, I think you're getting a license under both scenarios, but there are different things that you need to focus on to make sure that you've got real remedies that address the problems that are likely to happen in both different types of environments.
Right. Yeah, and in addition to cost, like you mentioned, there's a lot of other things you just talked about as far as non-financial, non-cost related issues to be thinking about or negotiating through. But back to the point of cost and the difference between cloud and on-premise, we've seen in our experience that a lot of times that there's hidden costs and escalators and things of that nature that even if it's not your number one priority is to contain those costs, those things can sort of sneak up on you. And those are clauses or kickers that weren't necessarily there when you were negotiating your on-premise systems, however many years ago. So what are your thoughts on just purely the cost side of cloud contracts and some of the pitfalls there versus the more traditional on-premise?
Yeah, well, and that's a nuanced issue, and I think it's a good issue to talk about because, for years, I think there's been this kind of mantra of the cloud, and I think it's, most of the contracts that we negotiate today and most of the contracts that we litigate today are certainly subscription-based agreements. They're cloud agreements, and that really is just the way the industry is going. But, the mantra that the cloud is cheaper and that it's less expensive and you don't need as much to get the same system as a big company. I think there's some truth to that, but underlying it all, and you suggest this yourself, is that there are enormous pitfalls with respect to ongoing costs and fees and escalators and that kind of thing. And you really have to understand what you're getting yourself into, and to make sure that you negotiate proper discounts, that you're not unnecessarily locked in. There aren't just the vendor isn't at his discretion with respect to the kinds of price increases that can happen year over year. You've got to make sure that you've got the right caps in place, that you can manage that contract appropriately. Because once you're in it, it's really hard to get out of. And I don't think that people think about that necessarily. I mean, when you're running your entire business on a cloud-based product, just switching it, in a matter of months is not necessarily something that you can do. And the vendors know that. And, their goal in a very real way is to lock you in and to, charge you money for their services and to some extent extract fees from you on an ongoing basis. And that has kind of a negative connotation. I think that's really what these salespeople try to do. It's get you on their system, make it hard for you to get out, and bill you as much as they can. And you've got to be aware of that on the front end, that's going to happen.
Yeah, it's almost creating higher barriers to entry or making the switching costs higher for you in this new world of cloud contracts.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And I think what goes hand in hand with that, it's not from everything relates back to cost fundamentally, but what you have to make sure you account for, not in addition to just cost increases in general and discounts and putting some kind of control or cap on a vendor's ability to do that, is how do you get your data out of that system, right? I mean, what kind of obligation will that vendor have with respect to pulling your data out and giving it back to you? Because what you don't want is to walk right into a situation where your data is held hostage. And, I'm not saying that that's the intent of any kind of vendor, but a lot of times the contract language doesn't obligate them to do anything with it. And sometimes, there's a fee for transferring your data or for having some kind of a transitional use right or transitional services to another. And, that you've got to make sure that you go in with open eyes and that you're able to mitigate any kind of cost associated with that. Because, for me, there's two competing interests in either type of agreement, whether it's a on-premise document or if it's a subscription agreement. And the vendor's goal in every one of these agreements is to put as many restrictions on you as possible with respect to your use of that functionality and to capture additional revenue streams on an ongoing basis, right? So it's here's the usage metric, here's the user count, here's what this type of functionality does. If you want to add different types of functionality, there's going to be a cost for it, and that's fine. That's just the way it is, and that's to be expected. But the user's competing interest, I think, very much is to have as much flexibility as possible. So the goal really is, to the extent you can get there, is to have as much indicia of ownership over that functionality, that technology, software, as you possibly can have in the context of the license or the subscription. So it's about having flexibility to run your business the way that you want to run your business without having to be constrained by the vendor's fences around your relationship with that piece of technology, or to the extent that you need to at least know what those fences are and what the fee is. So if you know that, then I think you're well ahead of the game.
Right. Well, that's great advice. We're going to take a quick break, and we're going to come back. I have a couple questions I want to ask you around specifically negotiating with systems integrators and resellers, and also talk to you a little bit about what is different now in this post-pandemic world we're living in. So we'll be right back with Marcus Harris, attorney at law, here on the Ground Control Podcast.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the 2021 Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how to take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm here with Paresa Noble, and we are here with Marcus Harris. And before we get back to the interview with Marcus Harris, what are your thoughts so far, Paresa?
It's awesome. I mean, Marcus is a wealth of knowledge. I love his perspective on how you should go to the table. I think a lot of people think of negotiations as, how can I get the best price? How can I get the best deal? And he even mentioned that, but it's so much more than that. And if you overlook the opportunity of setting forth those processes and outlining, who's responsible for what in the negotiations phase, then you're missing out on a big opportunity for a good partnership. So I think that was very interesting. And then I'm also fascinated by his perspective around cloud versus on-premise negotiations. So, if you're negotiating with a software vendor that has a cloud-based ERP system, for example, you're after that flexibility. You're after the short, subscription commitments. But in addition to that, it's how is the vendor handling the data? How do you handle a data breach? Who's responsible if things go south, and, who's liable at the end of the day? These are things that you aren't necessarily negotiating with an on-premise software vendor, right? So I thought that was super interesting. And it kind of brought up our conversation from our last episode with Daryl just around cybersecurity. And I'm curious on your take on this. I mean, we've had conversations about the security of, hosting your ERP system on the cloud. And as we walk into 2021 with these heightened cyber risks, I mean, let's unpack it. What are the main risks that you take on with a cloud ERP software versus an on-premise software? And how can you kind of mitigate those risks?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's a lot to think about there. I mean, I think first of all, a lot of companies, if I back up even more and just look at cloud versus on-premise, a lot of times companies think, well, I've got to go to the cloud, and chances are you probably do need to go to the cloud simply because so many vendors are pushing their flagship products into the cloud, and at some point soon, I think a lot of companies aren't going to have an option other than to go to the cloud. But to your point, there's a lot of nuances or kind of things that are unique to cloud solutions. I mean, first of all, with on-premise, when you negotiate a contract, it's sort of like buying a car. You're negotiating that initial purchase, and yes, you have your ongoing maintenance. That's there's a cost there, but the bulk of what you're spending is that one-time purchase. And if you negotiate a great one-time purchase, you're pretty well set. And not to say you can't negotiate the ongoing maintenance, but that's not as material as that upfront purchase. But with cloud, if whatever you negotiate with a cloud provider, that's going on, that goes on into perpetuity. I mean, until you decide to cancel or move away from that cloud system, which of course you want to make sure you've got the right protections there if you do decide to do that. So I guess I would say the stakes are higher. You've got more to gain or lose by negotiating a good agreement with cloud providers.
Interesting. That makes sense. I mean, with one side of it, I mean, with an on-premise solution, you own that code. It's up to you. If it's up to you, however you want to run it, however you want to customize it, etc. That's on you. Whereas you don't have that with the cloud. You're kind of at the mercy of what the software vendor is doing. So addressing that up front is huge. And that takes me kind of into another lane of which, if you have the on-premise solution and you do all these customizations and say, you're integrating it with a CRM system that's also on-premise, and you do all these different edits in the functionality of the softwares, and how does that, I mean, it affects your ability to keep all of your systems up to date, right? Whereas if you have a cloud ERP, you can bet on the fact that the software vendor is pushing out updates regularly. So those two things, making sure you have updated software, I mean, that also plays into the cyber risk, right? Are you better off in the cloud because you know that you'll always have an updated software? Or, do you take that on internally with your IT team? What's the better scenario?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't know that there's an easy answer, because I think there's, just like any major decision like that you might make, there's trade-offs, and you're kind of shifting one risk for another. But I will say that I think a lot of the concern around cybersecurity is obviously warranted. In last week's episode, if you didn't hear last week's episode, we had the conversation with Daryl Crockett, who's a cybersecurity expert that Paresa mentioned, and we really unpacked the whole SolarWinds cybersecurity breach, which affected a lot of large companies in the world, as well as the U.S. government, among other parties. And anytime there's a major breach like that, I think it causes a sort of trepidation or fear among executives of, hey, we don't want that. We don't want to have a bullseye on us because we're using some big cloud provider that, a lot of people throughout the world are trying to hack. Let's just kind of bring things in-house and manage it ourselves. And it may sound good in theory, but the way I look at it is, who's going to do a better job of keeping intruders out? Is it going to be the company that has a lot more to lose with all their customers that are using the product if they have a breach versus, a mom and pop, a mid-sized company that has maybe a couple IT guys or gals that are trying to patch together some security? I mean, who's good? You can kind of do the math or make some assumptions of who's going to do a better job of tightening up security. So on one hand, yes, when there's a breach, it's a big deal when it's a big cloud provider. But I mean, in the grand scheme of things, they are few and far between. When they happen, it's a big deal, obviously, but you don't hear about the little mom and pop shop that had an IT security breach, and no one's ever heard of the company, so you never hear about those breaches that happen every day. So you've got to kind of weigh the pros and cons there.
Right. I mean, there's always going to be a little bit of risk no matter what you do if you incorporate technology, right? But that's a good point, is where is the risk heavier? That's a good point.
Yeah, and really just, it goes for any decision around your transformation, whether it's new technology or process changes or how you're going to reorganize your company, change your culture, all that stuff. I mean, there's no silver bullet easy answer. And in most cases, you're shifting one risk for another, and you've got to figure out what risk you're most comfortable with. And then what risks remain, you want to make sure you're doing something to mitigate those. I think that's the key, is to just have a realistic expectation around that.
Right. I love it. Well, I'm excited to hear more about what Marcus has to say. So shall we jump back in?
Well, I'm here with Marcus Harris, attorney at law, talking about contract negotiations with software vendors and system integrators. And before the break, we were talking about cloud subscription licenses and contracts and some of the pitfalls and things to be looking for there. But one thing I wanted to do is shift gears a little bit and talk more specifically around system integrators or VARs, resellers, implementers, whatever you want to call them, basically the implementing partner that's going to help you implement the technology. And you alluded a little bit to this earlier in the conversation, but when we think about negotiating with system integrators or the implementers, what are some of the nuances of negotiating with them, some of the things to be watching for?
Yeah, well, I think really it's a whole different game, right? Because when you're negotiating with a software vendor, the negotiation points are fundamentally different. And I think what you've got to realize on the technology side, and there's some qualifications to this, but look, generally, if you're using a first, second, even third tier software provider, the technology works, okay? And it absent some issues associated with being oversold or misrepresenting certain types of functionality, that's not usually why these things fail, these implementations. Okay, it's very rarely, and I don't think I've ever seen it be a purely technical issue where the software or piece of functionality just didn't work. It's usually one of two things. One, it's a fraudulent inducement or negligent misrepresentation scenario, and those are just fancy legal words for software being oversold by an overzealous sales team. Okay. They're either entering that vertical for the first time and they really want to get in there. They don't really know, what the gaps in functionality are, so they oversell it or they minimize them. And you buy that software and then it doesn't work the way you anticipated it working. That's a fundamentally different issue, though, than I think it just not working, right? But that's one bucket of issues that I think you need to be cognizant of when you're negotiating with your software vendor. But where it's more likely to fail is because of a people issue. And the people issues are fundamentally going to be contained in the integrator or implementer documents. So the master services agreement, the consulting agreement, and the subsequent statements of work associated with the project. And the good thing about it, though, I think if you go in with eyes wide open, then you've got a real opportunity with the negotiation of that contract to put stopgaps in place on the front end that are going to minimize the likelihood that your implementation results in a failure. So, what are some of those stopgaps that you put in? Well, you want to have the ability to manage the types of consultants that you're going to get. You want to make sure that they're primarily focused on your implementation. There's a whole bunch of legal ways to do this, but what we see regularly, and it doesn't always result in failure, but we see, you get promised essentially the A team, okay, and then you end up with the D team, and it's sometimes because a bigger customer comes along that sucks up all the resources, and it's a more profitable project for the implementer, and so now you're left with kind of the bench that really isn't as good as what you thought you were going to get, and so now you take a second place to this other customer. That happens on a pretty regular basis. But, the good thing is, though, you can put in language in the contract that minimizes the likelihood that it's going to happen. And to the extent it does happen, then you got a process for dealing with it. So it's those types of things that you want to think about on the front end so that you don't have to deal with them on the back end. And and make no mistake about it, when I say back end, I mean through a lawsuit or litigation or through a failure. So if you can do as much as you can on the front end with these implementation agreements, these consulting agreements, integration agreements to manage that team, then you're really putting yourself in a successful position, and you're minimizing the likelihood that you're going to have a failure. So I think that's one of the biggest things to watch out for, and it's not a technology issue; it's a people issue.
Right. Now, do you notice a difference between negotiating with some of the larger system integrators and implementers versus the smaller, more boutique ones? Are there different types of issues you worry about? I'm sure there's a lot of commonalities, but are there differences or things you worry about one over the other, or any difference there?
Yeah, I mean, there are, and I think when you're dealing with a smaller firm, you really want to make sure that you've got language in there that really minimizes the likelihood that they're going to have resource issues with their consultant. You want to make sure that they are assigning the people that you expect to be assigned to that project, and they're going to be there from the beginning to the very end, to the extent you can do that. And there are issues with that is to minimize or to come to an agreement with somebody like that. And I think generally, though, those types of companies are less sophisticated. The agreements are worse. They take longer to negotiate. When you're dealing with the Accentures or the Capgeminis of the world, you're dealing with a much different type of animal. But fundamentally, the issues are the same. But you've got to deal with it and come at it from a different type of perspective. You're usually going to have within the four corners of their contract and their SOWs, and you're going to have to be suggesting language to them. They may already have their built-in ways for dealing with things, and you're going to have to adapt to using their clauses, their provisions, and working with that to make it work for you. Because remember, all these companies that you're going to deal with, they're going to give you concessions, but the language that they're couched in, that language is going to be incredibly unreasonable. It's going to be one-sided, so you're going to have to modify it to make sure that it addresses what your concerns are, while at the same time addressing their concerns. And I think the biggest risk you've got with one of these large scale implementers, the Capgeminis or the Accentures of the world, is that they use your project in one of two ways, right? They see it essentially as a cash cow that doesn't have an end, that doesn't they don't have much regard for an agreed upon scope. They'll put language in the statements of work that minimize your ability to manage the scope or manage the project. And you've got to watch out for that. The other thing that they sometimes do is they use your project as a training ground for unqualified or incompetent even consultants. And you've got to manage for that as well. There's actually a term that I learned from you. You don't want to get eccentric, right? And that's something that I think they can pump the billable hour through a project, and you've got to minimize their ability to do that and make sure that you have the contract tools in place to manage that scope. Because if you don't, you're going to spend an incredible amount of money, whatever scope estimate or budget estimate they gave you in the beginning, you're going to blow through that quickly. And you're going to be many months into your project or years into your project, you're not going to be anything. And, that happens all the time, frankly. And we have clients that come to us and say, what do I do now?
Yeah. And I look back in my career and look at how I started, and that's how I started. I worked for a big system integrator that taught me about consulting, but I learned about it on clients' dimes, and there was a lot of people there like me that were, just off the school bus, so to speak, just out of grad school or out of business school. And, you're learning on the client's dime. So I think that's a really good advice. And, and also it gets back to transparency and also control of the project. Who actually controls the project and owns the project? Do you own it, or does the system integrator and VAR own it? I don't know if you run into that issue. I know at a later date, we're going to talk about failures and lawsuits. But without going too far down that path, what are some of the nuances there, or some of the challenges you've seen?
Well, that's standard, integrator language. You look at an SOW, and the assumption section of that SOW become incredibly important. What happens is that they say that they're working for you at your direction, and they essentially try to wash their hand of the project as much as they can from a management standpoint, that they're going to take their direction from you. But the problem with that is, the life cycle of one of these systems is, I don't know, 15 years, 20 years. So the likelihood that anyone in your organization has substantive project management experience that's recent is probably minimal. You're not going to understand how to manage that project, and they're going to take advantage of you. They do it all the time. And so, the key is, again, putting in milestones, deliverables, deadlines, dates, a rigorous change management process that holds them to account. Because if you do that, then I think you minimize the likelihood that you're going to get accentured, so to speak, right? And I think it's imperative upon you as a customer really to make sure that you're bringing in outside consultants, or to the extent you've got in-house experience, rely on that. But you're just going to be outmatched if you don't have people on your team managing your project, both from just a day-to-day management perspective and really from a change management perspective too. I think that becomes important this day and age to get the right kinds of consultants on board, because if you don't, I think you increase the likelihood of a failure, and the cost that you're going to expend on these types of consultants, it's going to be minimal when you compare it to having to go through right setting a project, potentially getting lawyers involved, and abandoning whatever functionality or software that you were trying to implement and starting all over. And unfortunately, we see that pretty regularly. And I'll nip that in the bud, some planning and proper resource allocation on the front end.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that that it's such an interesting dynamic with some of the system integrators, or at least especially the larger ones, I should say, whether it's Accenture, Deloitte, or without naming too many names, just any bigger system integrator. Is on one hand, it's like they want to have control and they want you just to trust them, trust the process, trust the way we've staffed this. But as we'll talk about in a future interview, and I've heard you and I have talked a lot about this, is when it comes time for failure or there's a lawsuit, then it turns into finger pointing. So even though I wanted to control the project and bill you as much as I could and get you just to trust me and trust the process, now that there's a problem, I'm going to point the finger back at you and say, well, it's your fault, or you Mr. or Mrs. Client didn't do what you said you should have done, or didn't do what it said in the contract. So that's a pretty interesting dynamic, how it kind of cuts both ways in many ways.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is, and that's kind of the bread and butter of the integrator side, is to give themselves the flexibility to be able to point the finger back at you, but in the project management, have enough control to be able to assign the resources they want, to work on it the way they want to some extent protect their revenue stream. And I mean, I feel like we're beating up on them and being a little bit negative, but again, we see this. Not every day, but certainly, I mean, it's a major component of my practice. And, how these guys operate, and they give themselves the flexibility to be able to have it both ways. And, if you're going in with your eyes closed, it's like a lamb to the slaughter to some extent, and you're not going to come out of that unscathed. They're definitely going to point the finger at you. They're going to have the tools in that contract process to be able to do it. So,
yeah. Well, it's always interesting to me too how all the stuff you're talking about so far is so important, but yet when we look at organizations and where they focus their time and effort, they spend so much time and effort on trying to figure out what technology do I want, and make sure they're finding the right fit, that's an important step in the process. But then it comes time to review the contract, and usually it's a CIO or an IT director or CFO maybe who just kind of passes it on to legal counsel, their internal legal counsel, who's never reviewed an ERP or software or contract in their lives potentially, but they're the ones that are providing more of the legal input. But a lot of what you're talking about isn't just legal stuff. It's more strategic, how you're going to run the project, how you're going to own it, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. And it goes beyond just the pure T's and C's, you know what I mean? And I think, to be quite honest with you, I think any competent lawyer that negotiates commercial transactions is going to have an understanding of limitations of liability, warranty obligations, indemnities. Those types of things are relatively standard. There's nuances, without a doubt, in this world that are applicable, and not every commercial transactions attorney is going to understand them. But what I think you get when you have experienced counsel that has been doing these types of deals for a very long time is you get that kind of perspective, right? You want somebody that understands how they fail, because if you've got somebody that's negotiating in a vacuum, from a theoretical standpoint, that's not really going to serve you very well. You've got to have somebody that can balance those types of things. My biggest issue with clients, and this happens a lot. Not only do they review them without the competency to review them, when they give them to us, many times they say, "We'll take a light touch on this. We don't really want to spend a lot of money on this. Just focus on the big things." And that's incredibly challenging to do. And to some extent, I think it's short-sighted, because if you're spending millions of dollars on a software project and you don't have the right budget to review the contract, which is the one tool that you can really use to manage that project and mitigate against a failure, you're not really looking at this in the right way from my perspective. I think you're almost shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah, and you're talking about such big risk, high ticket, high dollar types of issues that if you gloss over this, I mean, you're gonna be paying for it both financially and risk mitigation wise for a long time.
Yeah, and I think the financial aspect of it, it's not just what's right in front of you either, right? I mean, it's not just the money that you're out that you paid. It's about let's say you go through a failure and you've got a large consulting firm and you've got one of the top ERP vendors or whatever software it is you're integrating or implementing, and it fails, and it's the backbone of your business. So it's not just the fees that you're out, but it's conceptually, where would you have been had that software worked financially? If this thing took you a year and a half to figure out it didn't work, or longer, think about all the resource allocation and the profit that you didn't get to realize because you're not where you thought you were going to be. And and it's not just that. So it's the money that you're out, it's where you would be today, and then it's the cost of what we call cover, right? It's replacing that software and that integrator with somebody that's competent. So now you've got to do it all again. And I don't know what the average implementation time is. It depends on what you're implementing, I suppose. But let's just say it's a year and a half or 2 years for some huge project. Now you're 4 years away from where you were. And we've talked about these things before. You've got like the little example comes to mind where it took years to implement this software. It failed because of some nuanced issue that they should have known about beforehand. And at the end of the day, they went back to their legacy their legacy system. Where would they be today had the software done what they thought it was going to do?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So this is a lot of good stuff to think about. And as our audience who may be about to sign on the dotted line for a contract or an implementation of technology, what are those 2 or 3 closing things that you would summarize? Here are the things you should be thinking about or looking for or doing as you continue down that path.
Yeah, I think what I would emphasize is don't just focus on price, okay? Because if you're focusing just on the cost of the software on the front end, you're really doing yourself a disservice, and you're missing opportunities to manage the overall cost of that system for the life cycle of that product, for the life cycle of the license, for the subscription that you're going to have. So you want to think about just not just the money you're spending today, but put in place caps, flexibility provisions that allow you to suspend portions of the license to trade out pieces of functionality. That's how you need to be thinking. You've got to be thinking from not just the initial cash outlay, but a flexibility over the long term. And what flexibility equates to is cost savings. That, I think, is really on the software side. Okay. On the integration side, I think it's really all about project management. You've got to make sure certainly that you've got the reps and warranties that you need on the front end, that these services are going to be provided in accordance with generally accepted industry standards or whatever the metric is, right? It's always, these warranties are always a warranty of reference, so it's to something, some sort of specification, and it's a warranty of time. It's a period of time, how long that warranty is going to last. That's all important stuff. But I think more important to some extent is that you're focusing on the aspects of the deal where the project is likely to fail. And you're putting your fingers in the dike, that anticipating it, and you're mitigating the likelihood that that's going to happen. That to me just makes the most sense. And I think it's not just in the base consulting agreement, but it's in the SWs, it's in collateral documents that you might see, project status reports. How are those going to be handled? What are they going to say? How often are they provided? Prints, specifications, all of that stuff becomes incredibly important. It all ties together. And if you're not thinking that way, you're going to be in for a process, and it's not going to be a fun process.
Yeah. As difficult as attorneys are to deal with, no offense, it's a lot easier to deal with them early on than having to deal with someone like you later on when there's a failure or some sort of contract dispute.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's a saying in my business that early legal advice is not expensive. Okay, it's legal advice that you get on the back end. That's when it becomes incredibly expensive. And when we talk about litigation and these things fail, I mean, maybe we'll talk about some of the pricing, the cost of litigation, and how much these legal fees actually cost. Because once you know that, the contract negotiation process, the legal fees that you spend on that's a bargain, to be quite honest with you.
Right. Yeah. It's always cheaper to get it right the first time.
Exactly.
Well, good. Well, I appreciate all the feedback and the great discussion here. How does our audience get a hold of you if they want to learn more about you? What's your website address, or what's the best way to find you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the easiest way to find me is really taflaw.com is my URL, and you can just plug my name in there, Marcus Harris, in the attorney directory, or just search Marcus Harris software. A bunch of things are going to come up, from blog posts to YouTube videos to things like this. So easy to find. It's just Taflaw, Marcus Harris, software attorney. Those are the best ways, and you can go from there. Check out some of the things I've published, some of the things I've said, and decide if you want us to help you out over here at Taflaw.
Okay, great. And we'll include a link to your email address in the information field below for those listening that are interested in reaching out to you. So thank you very much for joining us here today, Marcus. We appreciate having you, or appreciate you being on the show today.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always a pleasure. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Marcus. Okay, so that was an interesting discussion, a lot like the conversation with Daryl Crockett last week when we talked about cybersecurity. It's you end these conversations with a feeling of you're informed, but you're also a bit scared, and that's kind of the same feeling I get here with Marcus.
Absolutely. I mean, it's like you're enlightened, but you're like, oh, geez, I need to really think about these things that I haven't considered yet. So that's good.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about Marcus, too, you compare him to Daryl, if you saw the episode last week, she's got, she gets worked up a little bit easier than Marcus. Marcus is pretty cool, even keeled. And so when he talks about it, he's just so calm when he talks about these things that can go wrong. It's fascinating to me.
So calm and dropping bombs at the same time.
Yeah, exactly.
It's amazing.
Yeah,
I love it. I mean, I think one of the things that we could kind of dive into is he talked a lot about the system integrators, the resellers, the third parties that companies can bring in to help integrate technology. And I mean, we're a third party, right? So I would love for you to dive into how are we different than these system integrators and resellers that Marcus was talking about.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, first of all, we at Third Stage, we're independent technology agnostic. So we don't really care what technology a client is or isn't deploying. We have no allegiance or preference, on the sorts of technology they might use. So that's a really important thing, because I think with these system integrators and with software vendors too, when you're talking to different technology providers, they're obviously, their purpose is to sell you and to convince you that their solution is the best and it's the right thing for you, and it's going to solve all the world's problems. It's going to solve world hunger and everything under the sun. And, our job is to sort of be I don't want to say our job is to be the Marcus Harris of transformations, but we kind of have to counter that and say, okay, well, let's look at your business and what's important to you, and let's look at the entire business, not just the technology, but back to your point earlier about culture and process change and some of the things we talked about in the opening segment. How do we tie that all together? And so that's really the big difference, is we're not trying to force a square peg into a round hole. We're looking at the business transformation as a whole, and by the way, figuring out how technology fits within that rather than the other way around.
Right. Rather than coming at it with kind of like a hidden bias, it's coming at it agnostically. So that makes sense. And the other thing too that Marcus was talking about that really got my attention was the ERP failure side. I mean, we've talked about it a lot, is the expectation going into a digital transformation, making sure that the executives have the right expectation, the implementation team has the right expectation, just that everybody's in alignment on that front. And when you have a software vendor or a reseller or somebody coming in and really overhyping a software for your company, it could maybe set the wrong expectations, right? So I guess if you have that scenario and you are working with a reseller or somebody who is maybe not positioning their offering in the most transparent way, what effect does that have on a digital transformation as a whole? Does it put it at risk?
Yeah, it does, and it's not only does it put it at risk, but I'd say it's one of the, those unrealistic expectations that get set during the sales cycle is, you could argue it's either in my opinion, either the number one or number two root cause of failure. And the reason for that is, if you think about the dynamic of what happens if I sell you something that is totally misstating or setting inappropriate expectations, and you're banking on that, you're putting your career on the line, you're setting expectations internally within your organization, and you set the budget and the plan and everything based on these faulty assumptions. Suddenly you're backed into a corner from day one. You never really have a good chance to succeed without having to do something to either cut corners, which unfortunately ends up being things that are really important, like, let's not worry about culture, let's not worry about people, let's just figure out how to get this technology stuff done because I don't have enough time and resources to do the more important stuff. So, when you see these failures too, and Marcus and I have worked together on a lot of them. We as a company have worked independently of Marcus as well on other failures, either helping recover the failures and or being expert witnesses in lawsuits. But so often that's how it all started. It started with these faulty expectations up front. So to your question, it makes a big difference. It has a huge impact.
Right. I mean, I guess how you start something has a lot to do with how you finish it, right? So that makes sense. And another thing too, I mean, that plays into the true cost of an ERP failure. You have your upfront investment, right, of what you're paying for the software and the implementation, but does it ever come up, like, for example, in your expert witness cases that you've sat in on, does the opportunity cost ever come up with what the company could have been if the ERP implementation was successful, or the cost of, slowing down operations because you had this hiccup? Do those things that aren't necessarily incorporated into the project as a whole from the beginning ever litigated upon during a case?
Yeah, and a lot of it depends on how aggressive the attorneys are, in making their claims. And by the way, when we've been expert witnesses, we're experts on both sides. So we've been experts for the plaintiffs or the people that are suing someone over their failed transformation, and we've also been experts that are on the side of the defense or the system integrator, the software vendors, or whoever. And in both cases, you come across a lot of the same issues. And so when we are working these cases, a lot of times we see with the more aggressive attorneys, especially, that they'll use those opportunity costs, such as lost profits or added costs, higher labor costs because they actually had to hire more people just to maintain the system or to fix some of the problems created by the technology. So there's one case in particular. It was a large utility in the United States, and this was probably, 5 or 7 years ago. I was an expert for this case, and they had, I don't remember the exact number, but I remember it was in the hundreds of millions of dollars of lost profits that they were blaming on the failed transformation. And so the overall lawsuit was close. I mean, the amount they were alleging or trying to recover from from the defendant was close to $1 billion. It was in the several hundred million total, and most of that was opportunity cost, lost profit, and all that stuff you're talking about. They ended up settling, and unfortunately, when they settle, we as expert witnesses don't get to see what they settled on. It's usually confidential, so I have no idea, how much of that they got, but they got some amount from the software vendor as a result of those opportunity costs.
Wow, serious stuff. That's a lot.
Yeah, it is, for sure. And so Marcus has some good insights, and we're actually going to have him again on the show here in a couple weeks talking about failures. We're going to dive into that a little bit more in terms of what causes failure and some of the root causes and some of his insights as an attorney as it relates to transformation failure. So look for him on an upcoming episode here soon.
Awesome. Love it. I can't wait to have him back in. That was fascinating.
Yeah, it was good. All right, so when we come back from a quick break, we're going to shift gears and speak with a client of ours, James Hayward. He's the CFO of Jane's Defense Weekly, and we're going to talk to him and really get a client perspective, sort of a frontline lessons learned sort of discussion around what his experience was with his transformation and what some of the lessons are. And we look forward to that conversation, and we'll get to that conversation here right after a quick break. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstageconsulting.com.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. I'm here with Paresa Noble. My name is Eric Kimberling. Again, you can subscribe to Third Stage or Eric Kimberling on YouTube to see this video or to listen to this podcast every week, as well as other content that we publish on a weekly basis. Also encourage you to follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. And before we get to our next guest, who is a client of ours, I wanted to ask you a quick question. I know last time we talked a bit about Cobra Kai. We couldn't help but work in a little pop culture into the conversation, into the transformation culture. But have you ever seen or heard of that show on Discovery Channel here in the U.S. called Undercover Billionaire?
Yes, I love that show.
Is it not awesome?
It is pretty awesome, right? Yeah, that's a good one.
It is good. And the reason I bring that up is because this, for those of you that don't know or maybe haven't seen the show or maybe the show's not available in your market, it's a show where they take these billionaires and they give them $100. They give them an old car and they just drop them off in a city that they don't know ahead of time. They just drop them off and say, go make $1 million. See if you can turn $100 into $1 million within 90 days. And so it's a reality show. It's, I think it's on the third episode now, or somewhere around there. And the reason I bring this up is because it's a great, fascinating show, but we actually just landed a new client who is actually on the show. If you've ever heard of Grant Cardone, he is one of the 3 billionaires there in this season that's just starting here in January of 2021. And so new client of Third Stage. It's a fascinating company to work with because I've followed Grant for a long time and am fascinated by his work. And he's obviously a big influencer in the sales and training space. But have you been watching this season so far?
I haven't, but I have definitely seen Grant's posts about it. Has his episode come out yet, or is it not out yet?
It has. He's on every episode. So they have 3 people and they rotate. They kind of, each episode rotates back and forth between these 3 people.
I gotta watch it just because of him. He's awesome.
Yeah, he is, and he's, they're all smart, obviously. I mean, they're all smart enough to make a lot of money, and but in his case, it's just fascinating to watch his strategy. He has such a different. I don't want to give it away or do any kind of spoiler, but he has such a different approach to how he, what he does from day one. And I know in the previous segment before the break we're talking about Marcus and how do you get a transformation off on the right track from the start, and the better job you do there, the better job you're going to end up. And I have no idea how the show's going to end up, but coming out of the gates, he seemed that, in my opinion, even though I'm biased and I know he's a client and I'm a fan of his, I just thought, well, he's really got a unique, very smart strategy. Not that the others weren't, but his was particularly smart, I thought. So if you get a chance, it's a great show, and he's always entertaining to watch, and he's especially entertaining in this sort of situation too.
I bet. I can only imagine. I'm going to go watch it after this recording session.
yeah, we'll have to debrief on it next week, and I highly encourage the audience to check it out. We always try to support our clients, and so support Undercover Billionaire and Grant Cardone. We'll give a little plug for a client there. And speaking of clients, I want to shift gears and talk about another client of ours who is actually going to be here on the show with us today, James Hayward from Jane's Defense Weekly. James was the interim CFO during a transformation that we helped him with at Jane's Defense Weekly. It's an organization based out of the UK, and our UK office delivered the work that we did with him. So, James, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Look forward to chatting. Yeah, let's go.
Absolutely. So we're here talking about Jane's Defense Group, which is a client that we've worked with you on. They're in the UK. What can you tell us about Jane's Defense Group? What do they do? What's the scope of, how big they are? Maybe just give us a little bit of overview of the company.
Okay, so Jane's is a fascinating business. It started in 1898 when there was a General Jane who identified and used to draw pictures of naval ships. And the idea was that he would use these pictures to actually send out to military commanders so they could identify the profiles of ships on the horizon and identify them as enemy ships. And since then it has grown into what is called open source intelligence provider. And it provides information which is, by its definition, publicly available, mainly via the internet nowadays, on everything to do with intelligence, to do with the security, aerospace, defense industry around the world. Its major customers are the US government, is probably its biggest customer, and all the agencies that sit within it, the Five Eyes, NATO, but there's also, there's Japanese, I think we sold to, 95 countries around the world. And it's a fascinating insight into what you can glean from open source as to how you can provide that intelligence to the security and aerospace industries. It's a really, really high regarded business. And it was actually a privilege to be involved with them.
That's really interesting. It's not the everyday company that you come across.
No, it's not. It's the type of thing which, actually, you often see in the newspapers, accreditation to Jane's or whatever, as they will identify a tank which has been used in Syria or a tank that's been used on the Ukraine border, and actually it may well be a Jane's intelligence. Or sorry, somebody who works for Jane's. They're not intelligence officers. It's not classified at all, but they're experts in their field who can recognize the markings of a tank and say, well, that's a certain brigade that belongs there, and therefore that is part of the Russian infantry of, whichever. And from there, they can glean all sorts of information. It's all, as I said, it's all open source. There's nothing classified, but it's extraordinary. I've actually sat the open source intelligence course, also the introductory course, what you can glean from the internet and from knowledge. So they've got a hell of a reputation, and they were owned by IHS Markit, which is a huge conglomerate with 15,000 employees. It's just announced a merger. I can't quite remember whom with, but a very, very well regarded company. But there's 15,000 employees in IHS Markit. Jane's has got about 350 employees, and they were considered to be, not core to the IHS business. So they were put up for sale just over a year and a half ago. Highly profitable business, a very, very good one, but just not core to IHS's strategic vision. So they put up for sale, and they were bought by a private equity outfit just this time last year, just over a year ago.
Okay. So Jane's is a client of Third Stage, and you were involved with Jane's prior to our involvement, and you were brought in as interim CFO. Why were you brought in, and what were some of the major challenges you faced when you first came on board at Jane's?
So I was brought in because Jane's was part of a big corporate. When it was sold, they essentially transferred the business of Jane's, if I can call it that, the assets, everything to do with the business of Jane's was transferred. It was a division within the transport division of IHS. So they transferred the assets of Jane's or the business of Jane's into a new legal entity. But that was effectively it. It was the front end of Jane's. It was everything to do with the commercial side of Jane's. As a corporate, part of IHS market, there was not one single back office function that was transferred. There was no finance, there was no HR, there was no legal, there was no admin, there was no IT, there was no corporate structure at all other than the front end. So it was vanilla. They got the business and everything that the business delivered, but actually nothing to support it in terms of its whole infrastructure. So literally, there was one finance person came across who was an FP&A lady girl who was brilliant, absolutely central. That was the only back office person who came across. Nobody else at all. So we literally started with a blank slate. So I was interim CFO. Well, between the two of us, we were the whole finance department, supported by run-off agreements with IHS Market to support us in the transformation period. And that's exactly what happened. So I was brought in because I've worked in many companies, and I've as an interim, as a support to help companies. So I've seen what hopefully good structures look like, and I think that's part of what it was about. It's not me knowing the answers; it's probably more about me knowing the questions to ask. And so I was brought in by the private equity house to help that transformation from being part of a large corporate to part of a standalone within a private equity environment. So hopefully that answers the question. And actually, just to lay the scene there, so the corporate IHS, very well run, really good business, had the absolute classic ERP setup. It had SAP, it had Workday, it had Salesforce, and it had Concur. And I'm doing a similar job at the moment, and it's exactly the same setup. Completely different organization, but it's very similar. So it's a pretty well tested route, SAP, Workday, Concur, Salesforce. So none of this came across, should I say, as part of the transaction at all. So we started with a blank slate, which gives you an opportunity.
Right. So that's really interesting, and that's one of the interesting things about carve-outs is I think a lot of times when people think about a transformation, they think about, I've got my back office in place. It may be a mess and I need to improve it, but I at least have something there. Whereas what you're saying is you guys were sort of forced to stand up that back office and some of those internal processes and the things that were part of that, the larger entity.
Yeah, and actually both have their advantages. One of them is you start with a blank slate, which is what we had in James. So we literally start with a blank slate, but you've got to build it up. And you've got actually nobody there to build it up with. So you literally have to build. It's not just buying in it's not just getting the ERP system, commissioning it. It's actually educating, training people. Whereas, and I have done this, is go and fix it in businesses where you actually have a starting point, but it's just not working well. So both of them have their challenges and their advantages. Interestingly enough, one of the things that came out of the James transformation was because we had nobody there. One of the things we actually got a little bit wrong is not quite the right word, because you're never going to get everything right, and we'll touch upon this later in the talk, I'm sure. But one of the things which I've subsequently found, because I've handed over to a permanent replacement now, is that once you've gone live, because there were no staff there, there were no back office staff there at all. They didn't have any of the experience or the trade. Well, they did have some training, but the real training, the on-the-ground training, and you need more of that in a situation where you're doing a carve-out with absolutely zero backup at all. Whereas a business which is transforming, you've got a back office there. Actually, you will have staff there who know how the business works, who understand the mechanics and the flow of the business. Whereas in this situation, we started with a blank slate. So a little bit more training, and you can't beat real live, transactional training for these types of situations. It's just one of the challenges.
Right. Yeah. So how long of a time frame are we talking about here? From the time you were brought in until you actually had semi-working back office function? What kind of duration were we talking?
So I came in about a month before the transaction finally closed. And then we had a target to try and migrate across about an 11-month period, Salesforce, Workday, Concur, and SAP. So we did Salesforce, Workday earlier, Concur and SAP all became part of NetSuite, which is what we went across to. And so the whole thing has taken, I think they've just about got off their what's called TSAs, transactional service agreements. So the whole thing took about a year, and that was tight, and took a huge amount of investment in a program management office, and a lot of planning. So we did the whole thing in a year, and I've heard anecdotally of people who it's been a lot longer. I don't think I've heard many examples where it's ever been shorter than that. You might be able to shorten it by a month or 2 months, but these things take a lot of time, and a lot of investment in resource. So it's just over 1 year in. I now know that they are working and functioning properly on their new ERP system. I think all the ERP systems are now functioning properly. I mean, it's never a perfect world, and we'll come on to that, but it's worked.
Right. So what are some of in that year timeline, which is fairly aggressive if you think about all the things that must have gone into that. It's not just technology, obviously. You're also talking about standing up the business processes and the team and all that stuff. But what are some of the biggest challenges you faced when going through this transformation?
Well, for a start, we had no staff at all. I mean,
that's
literally,
a problem.
apart from you've got the what I call the front of house staff, the sales guys, the guys providing the content in the case of James, because it's intelligence, the CEO, the senior leadership team, and they are great, but they've been part of a corporate which has got many thousands of people, and actually what is very apparent is there's a huge amount of implicit support that goes into those structures, which people don't really realize they've got until it actually disappears. It's something which you wouldn't even explicitly think about until somebody takes it away. So part of it was about a culture change which happened over a period of time, making people realize that they were no longer supported by the mothership, as I would call it. There's a whole decision-making process. You're no longer going up through layers and layers and layers of management to get decisions. Guess what? Private equity world, you can make decisions within days, very, very quickly. If something's got to be done, it's got to be done. Recruitment was clearly a big challenge, and we spent a lot of time and a lot of investment into making sure we could recruit. We recruited about 90 people, of which probably more than half were in what I would call the back office functions. So that recruitment process started, really immediately the deal was signed, if not actually before the deal was finally completed, because you've got to get these people on board, and it just takes time. You want top quality people, and you're going to have to take 3 months to recruit and 3 months for them to work out their contracts. And before you know it, you're 6 to 8 to 9 months into your year. So that's a huge part of it. And we actually took on board a lot of interims. We set up program management offices, which was absolutely key. And I think I'll touch upon that later on. But having specialists who know what they're doing just gives you that peace of mind that actually your decisions are hopefully being formed in the context of people who understand the consequences and also the challenges that you're facing.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. So it's on the surface, it sounds like you had to stand up some technology and some systems, but when you really dig underneath that, there's a lot more to it, obviously, with the processes and the hiring and the people, the culture, all that good stuff.
It's only people who make decisions. It's only people who do things. All these systems, they're all good. Whether it's your NetSuite, your Dynamics, your SAP, your Oracle, whatever, they're all good systems. I mean, they're all mainstream, and some are more appropriate for different businesses. So the only thing that's probably going to let you down is actually people.
Right.
Um,
Absolutely.
Many
Well
people who
said.
drive machines.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. If you don't have good people but great technology, that's not going to do you a whole lot of good.
It's a very bad mix.
Yeah. Well, good. I'm going to build on that topic here in just a second. We're going to take a quick break here with Transformation Ground Control. We're here with James Hayward from Jane's Defense Group. We'll be right back.
I look around but I can never see a way out of this place for me.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. I'm here with James Hayward, talking about his transformation at Jane's Defense Weekly. What are your observations so far in the first part of the conversation, Paresa?
First of all, I love that he comes in and helps these companies through their challenges, through their transitions. I think that's amazing. With this specific company that he's working with, he mentioned that the transformation in whole took about a year. So I'm curious, is that the norm for, other clients that you've worked with? Does it usually take about a year from the moment you decide you need a new system to roll out, and your team adopting the software, or does it take longer? Is it shorter? What does it look like regularly?
Yeah, it's a common question, and excuse me, during for a mid-sized company, that seems pretty reasonable to spend about a year. The one thing that's unique, though, about his transformation is the fact that he had to stand up this whole, basically his whole infrastructure as a standalone as part of that carve-out. So you don't see that as often. Usually you've got something in place and you're trying to improve it, you're trying to shift to a different direction. But here he's almost starting with a clean slate, which part of me thinks, well, that's got to be more difficult. But then in other ways you think, well, actually, in some ways, starting with a clean slate might take less time because you're not weighed down by the baggage and the old ways of doing things because it's been ripped out. In his case, it's kind of been ripped away from him and he's got to start over. And I don't mean that in a bad way. Obviously, there's a reason for that. But so I don't know. I think it seems reasonable, but I know the key that he talked about was sort of the planning. I think the time he spent planning made it possible. If he hadn't done that much planning, then it might not have been the case.
Right. He mentioned some 2/3 of the whole transformation project was spent specifically in that planning and preparation phase. It makes sense because you're kind of building the foundation for this huge, uphaul and change in your company. So to make sure you have everything planned out makes sense. Yours or just other companies, are they putting enough weight on the planning phase and project mapping enough in those scenarios?
I'd say for the most part they're not. And it's interesting that he's a CFO because not to stereotype CFOs too much, but CFOs oftentimes are guilty of saying, hey, we've got a defined budget and a defined plan, and we want to go, and we want to minimize costs, minimize time, minimize resources. And so they end up oftentimes, again, as a broad stereotype or generalization, oftentimes CFOs especially are guilty of not planning because they just want to get into it and just jump and start going, and with the idea that they're going to speed things up. So I think it's not common enough. I think more companies should think that way of how can we spend more time planning, which is actually going to speed up the actual execution later on. And I would argue that you're going to be more cost effective and more efficient overall if you spend that extra time planning, even though it may feel like you're not moving fast enough during that planning phase, if that makes sense. You get this organizational momentum that sometimes gets the best of you because you just want to go and just start doing stuff without a clear plan.
Right. That makes sense. We've all had that.
Yeah.
You get excited and you're like, let's go. But then you realize you went a little too fast.
Yeah.
And the other thing too, I mean, I imagine there's different attributes that play into the duration of a transformation as a whole. I mean, maybe you could speak a little bit to what those attributes are. You know, is the size of the company probably one of the bigger players of what makes a transformation take longer? Could the type of system, like if you're doing an ERP versus a CRM system, what are the different attributes that change the duration of a transformation project?
Yeah, so the biggest attributes I would say are the size and complexity of the company. So, you know, if you're a global company with operations throughout the world, and you've got diverse operations, and you're trying to make those sorts of changes across a broad cross section of people and processes, then that's just going to take you longer by nature than a company that doesn't have those dynamics. You also have to look at how big of a change are you trying to make as part of your transformation. So, in other words, if you're let's say you're a younger startup type company and you don't have a lot to work with or to start with, your transformation is actually going to probably go a bit faster because you're not bogged down by history and politics and the way things used to be and all the stuff that's hard to change within an organization. That can actually help speed things up. But if you're a big company and you're trying to move from a really old way of doing things to a brand new cloud ERP system or technology that includes machine learning and artificial intelligence and all this cool new stuff, that's a huge jump, and that's just going to take longer to make that transition. So you kind of have to look at how big of a leap are you making. Is it an incremental improvement, or is it more of a quantum leap, and that's going to affect your time frame. Politics, culture, your organization, the people, all those things that they're hard to quantify or harder to quantify, but those will affect the duration as well.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah, that's good stuff. Well, let's get back to it. We've got some more questions for James. So let's get back to James here. Okay, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. I'm here with James Hayward of Jane's Defense Group. And before the break, James, we were talking about some of the challenges that you had with the transformation and just all the magnitude of scope of all the things you had to address in standing up some of these back office functions and systems and team members. But you said something that was really interesting in the midst of all that. You talked about culture, and you mentioned that there's a cultural change or a cultural shift that you had to enable as part of this transformation. Maybe help us understand that. What was that cultural shift? How did you go about it? What was that all about?
It's simply the fact that you're taking an organization, and particularly a management team, who've been part of a it's not a rigid hierarchy. It was a great company on reflection, but you're dealing with a company that had 15,000 people in, and to run a 15,000 person business. And I'm actually dealing with one now, which has got a 60,000, which was 60,000 people. To run an organization like that, you actually have to have quite a sophisticated but quite a rigid structure for the decision-making process to work up and down. And actually, the materiality of information is completely different. So a business that's turning over, into the billions has got a completely different materiality level compared to one which is being carved out, sold to private equity. It turns over, into the tens of millions or hundreds of millions or whatever it is. So what was important to the group under, corporate ownership, what was not important to the group in terms of, variances to performance is really important to a PE house. Yeah. So, and actually the ability to make a decision, you're not spending, oh God, this recruitment profile has been out there for 6 months. We haven't got anybody. If you want to get out and get somebody, recruit somebody, you go through the right channels and you get a decision within a day. So, right, go for it. Get on and do it. And some of it is it's a liberation of thought. We're all perfectly capable of doing it. But if you spent, the last 10 years working in an environment where every time you ask for a decision, you're not going to hear back for a month, 2 months or whatever, or ever, or that actually your performance, nobody really cares about the £100,000 issue here, and then you go to an environment which is completely different, whereby the £100,000 is material, and actually if you want to recruit somebody and they're important to the business, then damn well get on and do it. And so in a way you're liberating people from the shackles of a corporate environment, and both environments are right, but they're different. So the big corporate culture was making sure that people understood that the journey they were going to go on was going to be different to the journey that they've been on. And most people actually embrace that type of change, but it does require, you can't just force the horse to water to drink. You've just got to allow it to slowly, well, not slowly, but you've got to urge it and push it along a little bit, but accept that actually they're coming from a different place, and hopefully they'll all embrace it. Not everybody ever does. I mean, that's some people like the steadiness of the massive corporate, but that is a massive cultural change when you stand back and look at it for a lot of people.
In addition to the cultural nuances and components, and that's very interesting, by the way, just what a dramatic shift that must be. I think a lot of times companies, when they think about culture, if they think about culture, they're thinking more incremental changes and things that might be a little bit more measured. Whereas just given the situation here, it was more of a 180 in some ways, it sounds like, in terms of how that culture changed.
To go from a corporate background to a part of 15,000 people to one where you're standalone with only 350 people, that is a dramatic shift in positioning and temperament, whatever.
Yeah. So in addition to culture, when you think about PE-owned firms, and I know you've worked for and been involved with transformations at PE-owned firms and then just more corporate, non-PE-owned firms, how is it different going through a transformation in general for a company that's got private equity investors and maybe think of things a little bit differently?
Well, probably the most important thing to take into account is that the time horizon of the average PE investment, not all of them, but most of them, is 5 years. So, they come in, they really make their impact within the first year, 2 years, grow the business, and then look to exit by year 5. So by the end of year 4, their eyes are always on the exit. That's what they do. But by the end of year 4, they really are focusing in on the exit. So your time horizon within those businesses is, it is, shall I say, quite structured. 5 years, and therefore what you're going to be doing in the first couple of years, and at the end of the fourth year what you're going to be doing. So it's really quite a structured approach, but it's quite definitive. One might argue that actually within the quoted sector world, the time horizons are in a way horrendous, because you get judged on quarterly results. So people might have the ability within the quoted world to, or not the ability within the quoted world to say, well, actually, hell, if we don't deliver our results this quarter or the next quarter, we're all up for the high jump, and God help us all. Whereas in the private equity world, you could either say it's a short term or it's a long term play, because you say, well, actually, I know that I'm not going to get shot for missing my results for a month or for a quarter or for a half year. I will get shot, and I will be held to account if I don't deliver. But at least I've got an audience who will listen to me. So, they have their advantages. The decision-making process, I think, and I touched on this earlier, within private equity is much more agile. You're much closer to the board. That you're not part of a group, each of whom is competing for capital. You're part of a company that they've invested in, and they've invested in because they've got a vision for it. So the vision, their strategy, and your enablement of that strategy should be perfectly aligned. You're not competing with other divisions within a corporate, and therefore the decision-making process should be much, much quicker. You virtually can ring them up and say, this is what we want to do. You put your case, and you can get a decision. If it's a decision that goes up to the board level, you can get a decision within the week. And so they're much more, I think they've probably also got a slightly more risk culture, provided it sits in with their strategy for the business. So it is a fundamentally different dynamic that drives the PE structure. And listen, I'm not speaking for all PE houses, so I'm just talking broadly. That is a very, very different approach to how they manage the businesses, and it's liberating in some respects. But you'll also have your feet held to the fire in others. You can get away with it in big corporates. You can get away with some poor performance or whatever. They may just focus on your revenue, not your bottom line.
Right.
So,
yeah, and liberating is usually not the word that I associate with transformation. So it's good to hear that some of your experience has been liberating in that way, where you're able to see or affect a change that has helped make the companies more nimble or more responsive, whatever the case may be.
Well, I'd certainly say that I think there's a lot of cases of people who want to do things but feel hidebound by the slowness, the glacial decision making that happens in corporates. That we need to do this, but whereas they understand the importance of it, the people who actually make the decisions don't understand the importance. So they're not part of it. They're not close to it. Whereas the private equity owners will be much, much closer to the company. So I think it's liberating, because once people understand and realize that actually there's an alignment of interest for their company, they're not competing with other divisions. They may be competing with other strategies. That actually it's something which you can all point in the same direction a lot, and hopefully move forward a lot more quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. So with all of your experience with transformations at different companies, maybe I'll focus just on Jane's, and if you have other examples, those may apply as well. But what would you consider the most important components of a successful transformation? Are there a handful of things that sort of jump out at you based on your experience at Jane's as well as with other companies?
Yeah, there are. I've spent a lifetime actually helping companies, many of them which have been distressed. And one of the things which has always hit me is there's a massive relationship between failure and governance. And it's not a subject which people really like to talk about because it's a bit dull or whatever. But I've seen where governance is poor, results are poor. And whilst that can apply to, should I say, the whole corporate, if I look at a transformation project, if you don't get your governance right, you're setting yourself up to fail. It is just a mirror image of the larger problem which I've just discussed, which I've just mentioned, which is if you get poor governance in a company, then you're setting yourself up to fail. If you get poor governance on a transformation project, you're setting yourself up to fail. God's sake, get the governance right so that the reporting and everything about it is correct. Because if it's not, you'll all end up fighting. You'll all blame each other, and the whole thing will go, up in smoke. And the results from that just do not bear thinking about. So get your governance right. Preparation. I don't know how many times I could say it. Prepare. Put it all, invest it all up front. Do your preparation, and then everything else should actually flow from that. Setting up a program management office, really important. And invest properly in that. Don't think you're going to save some costs just by not investing in a program management office, because if you don't invest, you're kidding yourself, and you'll regret it. Most people, when they go through a transformation program, have probably never experienced it. Maybe some people, most people might experience once in their life. That does not mean that you know what to do at all. So just accept the fact that actually going from A to B, and it's something you've never done before, you might have done once, is something you should probably ask experts to help you with. Because if you get an expert who's done it 30 times, he will go straight to the nub of the problem way before you. And just because you're competent in an area doesn't mean that you're capable of getting it right the first time. And I'm sure, The second time you do it, you go, oh gosh, I'm that much further up the curve because I know exactly what to do. And the third time you do it, you're really a long way up the curve. So if you get somebody who's done it 20, 25 times, trust me, he's going to take you from A to B without going round the bloody houses at all, and knows how everything fits. So to me, you just don't kid yourself that you've got the experience to do it. Negotiating contracts with the likes of Oracle and Microsoft and AWS, whatever, the chances are, yes, you may be very good at negotiating contracts, but you have no idea what type of terms and conditions they're giving to other people. So whilst you may walk away thinking I think I've got a great deal, unless you've actually dealt with lots of contracts with these guys, you've got an absolutely asymmetric view on life. And therefore, don't think for yourself, don't think for one moment that you actually have the skill, the capacity, the capability to know whether you've even driven a good contract. And it's a contract that's fair. It's not just about money. It's about making sure the whole thing works for you. I would never profess ever to knowing anything about anything like this. I would just simply, I think that the job of somebody in my position is to ask the questions, not to answer them. I'm not experienced enough to say this is the right thing to do. I'm hopefully experienced enough to be able to say, I have no idea what is the right thing to do. I need some help. Building contingency, because it's never going to be as cheap as you think, and it's never going to deliver everything you think in the first instance. So manage people's expectations. Don't think that you've got a magic wand when you make a decision. The hardest part of the journey starts not when you've said we're going to transform. The hardest part comes when you actually say we're doing it now. We're actually delivering it. Making the decision to transform is easy. Actually delivering it is where it's really, really important. Last thing is, I say last, I'm sure we could go on for hours, but recruit early. Don't think, well, the system's going to go live in October, therefore we'll recruit in September. It's that is a real short-term saving for some. It's not a clever one. Just recruit early, get people, and just invest in training people and get them engaged as early as possible. Because it gets the cost of I'll touch on this, the cost of failure of a transformation. Sit down and ask yourself, what is going to happen if I can no longer invoice people? What's going to happen to my working capital? What's going to happen if I can't get my results out to the public? It's a quoted business. What's going to happen to the senior management team when I go to the private equity house and say this whole thing has gone wrong? There are the costs of fixing are just astronomical. The hidden costs of fixing. Don't try and kid yourselves about the upfront costs. Well, that'll cost tens of thousands of dollars to fix. The costs on the staff, the morale, the management team, if you get it wrong, are astronomical. So just do everything you can to make sure you get it right, and just don't kid yourselves by saving a nickel and diming here and there, because it will bite you in a way which, well, actually you probably won't know about because you'll be booted out, I suspect.
That's unfortunately you're right on that, and so much of what you're talking about here, I was jotting down some notes as you were talking. You mentioned governance, preparation, setting up a program management office, bringing in the right outside help, negotiations, etc. So much of what you've talked about and what you alluded to is the upfront piece of it, the stuff you do before the project really gets started. And what's interesting is that you were under fairly immense time pressure to stand this up. And I know a lot of organizations, a lot of clients we work with are under similar types of pressure, maybe for different reasons. Maybe there's economic conditions or a merger that's happened or whatever the case may be that is causing some sort of urgency. And then you add to that the whole agile movement and the need or the want that organizations have to be more nimble and move faster. So there's a lot of headwinds that would suggest that maybe you don't take that time up front because you're spending time up front planning and preparing when you could be doing. And so I think it's very interesting because it's almost counterintuitive, but very smart to say, we're going to take a step back to be able to take 2 steps forward and to take 2 steps forward quickly. So I guess the question would be, how much of the time of the year or so that you spent on the transformation, how much of that time, just order of magnitude, did you spend on that upfront preparation and all those things you talked about?
Yeah, I think we probably spent more time preparing than we did in the actual transforming, so to speak. No, we definitely did. We spent a lot more time preparing, getting the scope of works right, trying to understand the needs of the business fully, and absolutely scope everything out. Much more so than the data migration and should I say, towards the month or so up to the going live that was it. It was the going live data translation stage came towards the second half, or well into the second half of the project. And I think that I should say here that the thing about these projects as well, I think probably maybe more so on the finance side than on the other sides, is it's not until you actually start transforming the data into the way you want to see it and start using it that your red, amber, green start really wrapping up. Because you can get, if I was to say, the old classic red, amber, green, rag status for a project, don't kid yourself because you've got green. That it's actually really when you get to the final stages of the project that you really begin to stress test it. So don't think because you're green all the way up that you're not going to face your speed bumps, your reds, your ambers towards the back end of the project. But I'd like to think you mitigate it by doing lots and lots of preparation up front, getting the scope. The systems integrators you're going to use, they're going to do what you tell them to. And we actually had a specialist, on the financial side. We had somebody there who just sat as a go-between between the company and the systems integrator to really make sure that the interpretation of what we wanted was clearly and well defined. Because the systems integrator, if you say, go left, they'll go left. If you say jump, 1 step forward, they'll jump 1 step forward. If you actually shouldn't have said go left and you should have said go right, it's not their fault. You've got to make sure you give them a really clear instruction. And you won't know that until the very end of the project. So investing up front. So I would probably say, Eric, we spent close to 2/3 of the time, should I say, doing the preparation stage before the transfer. Some of it runs in parallel, but before the transformation ETL stage, to use the lingo. So just if you prepare it properly and you direct them properly, then you've got hopefully a half decent chance of getting it right.
Right. Well, that's fascinating because it's rare that you hear that someone, especially at your level, at a CFO level, at the C level, that recognizes that you're actually moving faster by taking that time up front to plan. I think the instinct is to just go. Let's not worry about planning. Let's go because we've only got 12 months or whatever our timeline is. So I think that's very intuitive and rare to hear that. So that's refreshing. If you had to summarize, for those of our audience members that are on a transformation or about to start a transformation of some sort, whether it's a digital transformation or business transformation or reorg, whatever it may be, how would you summarize just the closing words of advice you'd provide to them?
Okay, a couple of thoughts on that one. Consider the cost of failure up front. Genuinely, at the board level, you should consider what will happen if it goes wrong. Because it's easy to say, that's just the back office, let's let them get on with it. But just understand just what the costs are. And the costs are huge. I'm not just talking about financial costs if it goes wrong. You need to manage the expectations of the board. I say you, I don't mean that in some sort of preferred sense. I mean, one needs to manage the expectations of the board and the company. This is not a magic wand. You're not going to suddenly find yourself way better off for doing it. It will take time. It's not something you don't go. You don't climb Everest in a day. It takes you a long time to actually see the benefits of it. So just manage the expectations of the board. You're not going to solve all your problems with one fell swoop. It will take a long time to bed in. And just because you've gone live doesn't mean to say your project's over. It's not. You're probably just starting. Getting the benefits of it is not something. It's not turning a switch on and off. All right. It will take more time. It's going to cost you more than you want, and it's going to deliver less than you want in the short term. In the long term, I'm absolutely able to deliver everything. Well, hopefully, but it'll, manage the expectations. You've got to have champions running throughout the company, because you could easily get the board or somebody on the board saying, right, this is what we've got to do. You must have the champion on the board, but you need that vein running through the company, because if the champion at the top is not supported by the operations team, by the back office team who just say, yeah, this is the thing to do, then they're not even going to see it, because they're getting their monthly board report. They're not even going to see the resistance that you get on the ground. So you want to get the literally running the whole way down. And to me, some of the most important people in the company are those at the junior end. They're the ones who deal with the actual, should I say, the workings of these ERP systems day in, day out. Listen to them, for God's sake. They're the ones who are sitting there pushing the buttons and having to manage Workday or Salesforce or Concur or SAP or NetSuite. They're the ones who are doing it. So listen to what they do. Don't think that just because you've been there and done it and you're 30 years in the business, you know all the answers. No, we don't. It's systems are changing so rapidly and so often. There is no way we can keep up with it. So communicate and listen all the way down the organization. And final things was get independent advice. This is a holistic exercise. There is no way that any individual is going to understand how all the component parts, within a company, of how all the component parts, how these ERP systems all mix together, how Salesforce works with NetSuite, but it doesn't work with Dynamics or as well, or what's going to be required as middleware. You need independent advice, because you're not going to, unless you've been doing this for as long as you guys have, it's not going to work that you're going to know the answers. Because what was yesterday's solution, or the solution 2 years ago, will have moved on. What were the terms of a contract that Microsoft were offering you or offering people 2 years ago? Now it's more cloud-based. It's going to be different. What you can get, how you knit different countries together, what all those component parts are. Don't even think that you know the answers. You don't. So for God's sake, get independent advice, because if you get it wrong, it's going to cost you your company, your livelihood, and your job. And the very last thing I would say, and I will admit I've nicked this from somewhere. I read this recently and I thought this was brilliant. It says, "Be wary of the loud mouth with a strong opinion, masquerading as the expert, versus the quiet guy who spent his life researching an area." And I think that's great words, because we all know. We all know who those people are, and it's easy to be bowled over by them, but just take caution is what I would say.
Right. Well, that's great advice. I appreciate you sharing those insights, and obviously me being biased, I think one of the best decisions you made was to hire that independent outside help from our team at Third Stage. But that's me being biased, obviously there.
Yeah, it was brilliant. I mean, and in the schemes of the whole project, it was, to be fair, relatively, it was a tiny part of the cost of the whole project. But if you set off on the wrong course, at least I felt that we were setting off on the right course, and that was absolutely, it was money well worth spending, because it would be so easy to get these things wrong. So I always would countenance people to go to people who've had experience doing these things. Most people will never do this, or maybe once in their life.
Yep. Yep. And there's a lot of battle wounds and lessons to be learned after multiple
Yeah,
times through it. Well, James, thank you very much for being here today. I really appreciate your time and appreciate being on the show here today. I know you're on LinkedIn, so people can connect with you on LinkedIn. Any
of
other
course.
ways that they can get a hold of you or learn more about you, or is LinkedIn the best way?
LinkedIn is the best way because I'm just trying to rebuild our website.
There you go.
But no, LinkedIn is the best way.
Perfect. All right, James. Well, thank you very much. Hope you have a great rest of your day and appreciate you being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eric. Appreciate that.
All right. So fascinating conclusion to the conversation with James. What do you think?
I love it. I wrote down a quote because I think this is just applicable in life. He said, "Where governance is poor, results are poor." And he hit it out of the park with that one. I mean, if you're not keeping your project on track, how do you expect it to cross the finish line the way that you expected it to, right? So I guess, for us, we've been talking about one way to do that is pouring into your business case. And this goes back to that conversation of pouring into planning, right? When you first get out the gate and you're writing up your business case, making it more of something that you just want to get approved by your executive, but also making it the outline to your project and letting it be the guardrails to what you're doing and helping you guys make decisions. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that. How would you recommend people should consider building out their business case straight out the gate, and how can they use that to keep their project on track?
Yeah, it's a great observation and question because a lot of companies think that a business case is just to get the project approved, and they almost view it as a sort of a sales tactic. If I can show a business case that shows a really good ROI, the board or the management team is going to approve it, and we can move forward, and then we can forget about the business case from there. And that's a big mistake. As is the mistake that's I'd say it's even more common now. I don't have any data to back this. This is more qualitative instinct and just dealing with clients every day. But the more common challenge is that so many companies just don't even think about a business case, even to justify the project, because they say that, I've got to make a change. So there's no point in putting together a business case because we're going to go through this transformation because we've got old, outdated technologies, our processes are broken, we need to reorg. So what's the point of a business case? Well, James talked about what the point of a business case is. I would argue it's not nearly as important for justification purposes or selling the project as a business case is important for project governance. And in the way, to your question, the way to use it as a governance tool, in a real common example we see would be, let's just say you've got a business case that shows that you're going to reduce your inventory by, say 25% because you've got better predictive analytics and you've got better data, you can make better decisions, you've got a better handle on what your inventory actually is and when you're going to need it. So therefore, this new technology, new processes is going to help you reduce your inventory by 25%. Great, maybe that's realistic. Let's assume it's a realistic goal or target to set. What ends up happening is during the project at some point, someone's going to come along and say, okay, I want to customize the software and I want to make a change to the software that's going to add to the cost of the project. It's going to add to the risks and add to the time. It's easy to just say no, let's not do that because we don't want to. It's cheaper if we don't. But if you don't have the guiding principles of a business case to say, well, hold on, that might actually help us achieve that 25% inventory reduction that we have in our business case. So therefore, maybe we do want to do it. Or we can't point to anything in the business case that is going to be benefited from making this change or changing our scope, adding to the cost of the project, whatever the decision might be. So therefore, we're not going to. So that's, just sort of a common real life example of how a business case is so much more than just a justification tool in that way.
Right. It makes sense. And, again, it's how you start anything is how you're going to finish it. So having that thing straight out the gate that kind of sets the tone for the project, and sticking to it, I imagine that's something that could be used as a tool rather than just brushing it under the rug once you get your approvals and keeping on,
Yeah, absolutely.
And then another thing too, I noticed a lot of overlap between what Marcus and James were saying, in the sense that James outlined the true cost of an ERP failure a little bit differently, where he said, you may walk away from the negotiation table thinking you got a great deal from the software vendor, but unless you've seen a bunch of different software vendor contracts, you have a very one-sided view as to what your contract looks like and what price you got. So it circles back to the success of an ERP project or a digital transformation is the people that are a part of it. Do you have the right people at the table with you, negotiating with you? Do you have the right eyes and ears kind of helping oversee and push the project? A lot of, systems are great systems, right? And the success or failure of an ERP project will almost always come down to the people. That's where it falls, right? Is
Absolutely.
who's working on the project.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you could have the best technology in the world. You could have the perfectly designed business processes and operating model. But if your people aren't in sync or vice versa, the whole thing's going to fall flat.
That's right. And I imagine I'm excited to hear Adam's, perspective on kind of global digital strategy too, because I'm sure that plays into it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of Adam, let's bring back Adam here after a quick break. We're going to take a break and we're going to bring back Adam Cheatham, who is a director of strategy and transformation at Third Stage, and he's going to be chatting about transformations on a global scale. So if you're a larger, more complex, or a global company that does business internationally, this is definitely something you'll want to listen to. We'll be back with Adam Cheatham right after the break.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the 2021 Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how to take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. I'm here with Paresa and Noble. Thank you for listening in and watching here today. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channels. Follow us on follow Third Stage and myself on LinkedIn and Twitter or Facebook, whatever your social media platform of preference is. And also subscribe to the podcast on Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, all the usual suspects with podcast platforms. So be sure to check us out. We go live every Wednesday morning U.S. time with a new episode, so appreciate you guys listening here today. So we're going to introduce our next guest, who's Adam Cheatham. Adam is a director of strategy and transformation here at Third Stage Consulting in our U.S. office. I've actually worked with Adam for a long time, worked with him for a few years at the previous company that I had started, and he's been with Third Stage since the very early days. Within the first couple months, actually, of starting Third Stage, he was one of the first to join the team, and we've obviously grown quite a bit since then, but he was one of the original team members. And what we wanted to do today is we actually had a chance, we have a sister podcast called Digital Stratosphere, and Sarah Dokovich hosts that show, and she actually recently sat down with Adam to talk to him about transformation with global transformations. And so what I want to do is show that interview and turn it over to Sarah now for her interview with Adam. So we'll turn it over to you, Sarah.
My name is Sarah Dokovich and I'm your host. Thank you so much for joining us today. In today's episode, we're going to cover the topic of global transformation strategy. In a way, strategies for transformation share a number of key similarities. But how does the introduction of global and regional factors impact strategy? What should you pay attention to? And how do you balance everything? That's the topic we'll be covering today. Joining me for today's discussion is Adam Cheatham, Director of Strategy and Transformation at Third Stage Consulting Group, which is an independent and technology-agnostic digital transformation consulting firm. Adam and his colleagues have worked with some of the world's leading organizations in their transformation journeys, and he has provided support and guidance through defining a strategy that enables transformation success. Adam, thank you for joining us today.
Of course, thank you.
Yes, definitely. Great to have you. Now, I want to get into it. So, it seems like digital strategy can be a tough topic basically to take on. And I wanted to know, are there any tools or tactics that you start with to basically simplify the conversation to create a base foundation?
Yeah, so at a high level, digital transformation at a global or a local level or share some common characteristics. You really want to start with your executive alignment and making sure that your strategy is aligned there and that all of your executives are all on the same page. But you also need to know your business needs. And you want to do your due diligence up front so that you know that your strategy, when it rolls out, is going to really be able to take hold the way that you want it. You want to plan for failure and challenges along the way. And you want to take into account organizational change management, the people impact of change. All of these things you need to be paying attention to, whether or not you're conducting a global transformation or a smaller localized transformation. So there are some common characteristics, yes.
Okay, awesome. And I wanted to also touch on executive strategy alignment across the globe, because having different executives responsible for different regions, I'm sure can create some very different approaches in business. So can you tell us a little bit about how important the global alignment is for executives and how to achieve that?
Yeah, so at a basic level, the importance is pretty high. As you start to kind of roll out this global strategy, if you have different regions or different countries that are kind of off doing their own thing, the reach to the folks that are actually doing the work at the bottom level doesn't get there if you don't have the alignment at the executive level. So we start with that. We start at the top, and we get, as best we can, we get all the executives into a room. Sometimes it takes everybody flying to one location, which is, of course, right now a bit more difficult. But other times it's something that can be done remotely or can be done in chunks where you do maybe Asia Pacific, Europe, and then the Americas for organizations like that. From there, you want to know where they all sit and where they all stand and what their priorities are. For a country that is more focused on just the distribution and there isn't really any manufacturing in their area, they may not have the same needs as the region that is responsible for conducting the manufacturing and producing actual goods to be distributed by some of those other areas. So you want to take a look at kind of how your company is structured, the priorities and needs of each executive in each region, and then start thinking about how it is a global strategy starts and then rolls downwards.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's total like reverse engineering everything, starting like from the top, like you said, and like seeing what the kind of goal is, making sure everyone's on the same page, and then just working it that way. I love that. And those different models in different areas of the world may create different business needs. So can you give some examples, I guess, kind of like on one region of the world may have different needs, kind of like I guess we covered, and how to consider those differences as well?
Yes. Part of this is an industry-based thing. And another part of it can be what's available in the local area, right? So at an industry level, you may have some industries that have different types of demands and may meet the market in different ways. For example, if you're talking about providing food and services to smaller restaurants in an area, that level of demand might be different in one country than it is in another, or in one region than it is in another. And so how it is those partners demand attention from you could be different. On the other hand, there's also the idea that from a regulatory perspective in your industry, whether or not there are more increases in the regulations that you had to abide by, whether it's in Europe or in the United States, or if there are different changes depending on the region of the world. There are also different competencies across the world. I once had a client that had a decision to make on where they were going to manufacture things, and which manufacturing facility was going to get all the machines and which one wasn't. And their way of putting it was, well, It's the labor in this corner of the world is more expensive, so we're going to replace those with machines, and the labor in this other corner of the world is quite a lot cheaper. So it will cost us less to do the job if we just hire people. So those types of other things can impact how it is you roll out a strategy globally, and you should be paying attention to which parts of your business operate in what types of manners based on the structure of your business.
Yeah, wow. That sounds like there's a lot of differences, and that can really drive significant changes in how to approach creating a global strategy by the sounds of it. So really interesting stuff. And how do you make sure that you're doing all your due diligence and not have problems with analysis paralysis? Does that have like an impact on how you anticipate challenges along the way and plan for them as well?
Yeah, I mean, at some point you kind of have to, creating a global strategy can create a lot of detail, and you can really get down to some nitty gritty, minute details on that. But at the same time, if you don't get your strategy off the ground, it's all the work you put in, you don't get to take the benefit of it. So you had to find a balance, right? So managing down to the shop floor level with a digital strategy isn't effective. But at the same time, knowing what you want locally from your strategy is kind of where I like to play that balance. I want to know at the high level where everything's going to be the same, and then come down to a more regional level and know where things will be differentiated, so that we're not necessarily going down to the business unit level, the functional area level, or the individual task level for your strategy, because that's going to just take a lot of time. But you want to start thinking about how to keep out of the weeds and start thinking about how to just drive impact at a global level and in a way that fits with what it is you're trying to achieve. And if you find that your due diligence is taking you down a path that's causing you to be unable to employ your strategy, maybe stop for a second, pull things back up and say, what are we trying to accomplish here? And are we doing that? And are we adding that much value by going down to a lower level of detail? Or can we just get started and figure out the rest along the way? Because at some point, you've got to make a decision to get started, and you will never have every last piece of information.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that from my personal experience too. Like with just anything in life, if you just don't get started, you just don't know where it can end up, and then where you can kind of like change course in between that too, because you just have to implement. So.
Right. Like at some point you got to kind of give it a go. All your plans are going to change, and that's fine. You just have a strategic vision behind it, so that when those plans do change, what your general strategy is for accommodating those changes.
Yeah, that's perfect. I love it. And it seems like having that global organization can really create some significant complexity, how an organization would want to approach a digital transformation. And creating a strategy sounds like it may take a lot of effort, but it also can have a really good payoff. So I love everything that you've been covering so far. And when we come back from the break, I'm going to ask Adam some more questions about some of the common things that create these kinds of complexities in an international organization.
Okay, thank you, Sarah and Adam. We're going to take a quick break and come back with more discussion between the two on global transformation. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstageconsulting.com.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. I'm here with Paresa Noble, and we're right now hosting or listening to Sarah interview Adam Cheatham, who's our Director of Strategy and Transformation. Before we get back to Sarah and Adam, though, Paresa, what are some of your initial thoughts and observations based on the first part of the conversation?
Yeah, I love how Adam just simplifies it all, right? He mentioned that the foundations of any transformation, whether it's global or local, no matter the scale, it comes down to three things: executive alignment, knowing your business needs, and organizational change management. And, looking back at James's conversation, he said 2/3 of his transformation took place in the planning phase. I mean, two of the three bullets that Adam just listed off is in the project planning phase, right? Like, you have executive alignment and knowing your business needs, and arguably parts of OCM, right? All fall into that project planning phase. So it's interesting to hear the overlap there. They're pretty much saying the exact same thing, and they weren't in the conversation together. So it must be true, right?
Right. Well, and, even if you're not a global organization, even if, let's just say, you're a smaller business and you've got a single location and you're not as complex as a large international company, a lot of these companies that Adam was talking about, it's still a very relevant point. I mean, so many small companies think that, oh, we're not that complex, so we're going to jump in without a plan and just start doing stuff, and then in the spirit or in the name of being entrepreneurial and agile and all that stuff. And again, sounds good in theory, but you can get yourself into a lot of trouble by not having that solid plan, no matter how big or complex or small and simple your organization might be.
Right. It's easy, right? When you think of it that way, if you approach it with your head fully in the planning phase, out the gate, it sounds like it will help the situation a lot, regardless of the size and scope of your project.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's get back to Sarah and Adam. Sarah Dokovich is interviewing Adam Cheatham, so we'll turn it back to you, Sarah.
So Adam, I want to dig in a little bit deeper and a little bit more of the characteristics of global organizations that cause some of the complexities we talked about and how you recommend approaching them. So the biggest impact on global companies is often just the difference in region and local customs and expectations. So do you have any examples of how these kinds of cultural variances can impact a digital transformation?
Yes, I do. And some of the ways that these types of organizations that are globally spread regionally and culturally can create different expectations and different deployment methods, right? So there are a number of different tactics that we use, and one of my favorites is understanding what the power distance in an organization is culturally and what the level of individualism is in an organization. So when you think about a culture that is created and based on hierarchy and is designed for or intended where people who are working for you are expected to just kind of do their job, stay in their box, and kind of follow the script, if you will. There's a different approach that happens for that type of a culture than one that's a bit more decentralized, where anybody at any part in any area of the hierarchy can come up with an idea and run with it, and they're enabled to do that. So you want to kind of make sure along the way, as you are thinking about what regions you operate in, what are some of the areas where cultural differences constrain how it is your company communicates with each other, and how it is they address the needs of the market as well. So that when you have a particular product or service in one region versus another, different cultures are likely to have a different experience with that product or service. And that's something that you kind of want to think about, how your change as a strategy perspective and deploying that might impact your the way you engage with the marketplace and with the culture in the marketplace.
Yeah, great. And would you recommend a company design a strategy around these kinds of challenges?
Yeah, for sure. The last thing you want to do is design a strategy without thinking about how it is the way you go to market is going to be impacted, and how it is your people are going to be able to accommodate that. Culture, one of the things that is always fun to see is that culture shock goes both ways. So when you have one type of a culture dictating to another what it is will happen, it's really difficult for cultures with differences that are like that kind of power distance or individualism are set up, and where one might very much say this is the way that it works. Somebody up top said to do something, and so it's my job to do that. Where a different culture, when they're being told, maybe accustomed to challenging that, vetting it out, and making sure that they know their place and their role in it. And you want to design how you communicate to those two different styles of cultures in a way that gains alignment with your global strategy, so that the approach is different in those two examples, but the end result is the same, where you're all headed in the same direction.
Yeah, super interesting. It almost just really feels like a game of a little bit of Tetris, kind of putting it all together to make sure that everybody's on the same page, but also, like you said, the cultural, not necessarily cultural alignment, because cultures are so different, but making sure that you can accommodate for all of that to work together. I love that.
Yeah. You want to embrace those cultural differences that make your company what it is, and what, particularly in the areas of the world that you operate, so that you're allowing those types of things to become strengths as opposed to hindrances.
Definitely. Yeah. Now, it sounds like organizations that span continents will have structural differences that can impact how a digital strategy rolls out. And I wanted you to speak on, if you can, on how the operational structure needs to be considered and what kinds of factors create the greatest impacts on the success of a global strategy.
Yeah, that's another very good question. And the easiest way of putting it is, if you have an organization with offices in all 6 continents, plus, well, minus Antarctica, because not a lot of people do business there. But if you have locations across the globe, they're going to span different time zones. And having a location in the Americas, Europe, and Australia will cause you to run business around the clock effectively. And so as you're rolling out a digital strategy and any type of impact of that, and you're starting to go live, you're really going to kind of do that in chunks. Because like if you go live in Australia at noon, you're going live in the US probably somewhere around, I'd say, midnight, 4 a.m., somewhere in that ballpark. So yeah, it has there's a difference there that you want to be aware of in timing, just from a very basic level. And the time zones are time zones, and you can kind of work around that, especially with remote tools like Zoom and Teams and stuff like that. Yeah. So the other part of it is just how your organization is structured and where your centers are. Right. You might have distribution centers in all areas that are fed by individual production facilities in one corner of the world, but are fed by more third-party products in another part of the world. And those types of structures are things that you want to be aware of. So if you're doing all your production in Latin America, and then you're sending that to the States for distribution across North America, that might have a different approach than if you're doing all of your production in Germany and then distributing from Germany throughout Europe and into the Middle East and Africa, and those types of arrangements. Because the idea of Incoterms and different types of customs, international trade regulations are going to have an impact on that as well. And you want to start thinking about what those might do to impact your digital strategy as you roll it out across the globe.
Yeah, wow. There's a lot of things to consider for sure when it comes to more of an international kind of level of things. And based on everything you've touched on, it's like a global scale digital transformation dips into a handful of complicating factors. So I wanted to also ask you, what kind of change management tactics do you use to tie all of these complications together so that that the people side rather of change is effectively addressed?
Mm-hmm. There are a number that you wanted to take into account. One of them is just that change in culture from place to place, and being open and transparent between who's communicating with who on the idea that culture shock does go both ways, right? So you want to lean in and embrace that, and that's getting that conversation moving is a great change management tactic, and respecting that culture and measuring it in a way that allows you to say, when you're talking to two different people, we'll use an American speaking to maybe somebody from Singapore as an example, where my goal is to explore things and to find out what it is makes this unique, so then I can make a decision and I can charge head first into it. whereas my counterpart in Singapore might have a different experience where they're just there to do what they're told, and the structure there is a bit more hierarchical to say, I gain my way of doing things and my reasoning for doing things from someone else who tells me what to do, as opposed to from understanding and buying in personally. So they're understanding those types of cultural differences and what motivates people within a business environment is important, as well as just making sure that you're openly and effectively communicating and addressing and embracing a resistance that's going to come in one form or another. And very seldom comes in the form of just outright resistance. I don't like this, I'm not doing it. And change management, when you think about resistance, we also think about unintentional resistance, misalignment, as well as misunderstanding. Those are all three different types of resistance that your change management plan should account for, and identifying the areas where you might encounter those, whether it's misunderstanding because of cultural differences or misalignment because of cultural expectations, where I think we're saying the same thing, but we're really not. Yeah. Just the general unintentional resistance that comes from, I don't know what I'm doing, so I'll just do nothing. And providing the right amount of communication, knowing where those changes are going to come from with this type of a digital strategy is important when you're rolling out globally. The last thing that you want to do that kind of ties all of this together is conduct a change in impact assessment of how it is regionally, locally, globally, this strategy is going to impact your people, and think about what those changes are going to be. What is my level of resistance supposed to be? What is the level of perceived value at each level of these individuals who will help me employ this strategy across the globe? Because at the end of the day, your strategy could be as brilliant as it gets, but if you aren't engaging your people in a way where they're helping you deploy it, it won't get you anywhere, and you won't get the fruits out of it that you're expecting to. So,
yeah, that was such a great explanation of it all. It just makes it so clear. So I appreciate that. And I'm really appreciative that you can share all those insights. Now, if our listeners want to learn more, what are some resources that you might suggest for them?
Yeah, if you want to learn more, there are a number of ways to do that. You can, of course, continue to listen to the Digital Transformation podcast, the Digital Stratosphere podcast. You can also reach out to me through LinkedIn or look at some of our LinkedIn posts, whether it's on my page or on our Third Stage Consulting page. You can also check out our YouTube channel and subscribe to that for lots of great information on digital transformation.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Adam. Well, we're about out of time, but I really appreciate you being here. So thank you. And thank you all for listening. Again, my name is Sarah Djokovic, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Thank you, Sarah and Adam, for that great discussion. Appreciate you guys joining the show here today. We're going to take a quick break with some more thoughts from Paresa and I on that conversation. When we come back to Transformation Ground Control, we'll be right back.
Hey, Mama, it's me.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the 2021 Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how you can take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control podcast. We go live every Wednesday morning on YouTube. You can also find us on all the usual podcast platforms. Be sure to subscribe to us, follow us on social media, all that good stuff. Stay engaged, ask questions. We've got a lot of questions we want to make sure to cover on this show, and encourage any sort of feedback or questions you might have as an audience here today. And we have another question that we're going to get to here in a second from social media and some interaction we've had. But before we do that, let's debrief here on this whole discussion with Adam Cheatham, the interview that Sarah had with him about global transformations. What are some of your other takeaways and thoughts there?
Yeah, I think it's, a lot of our conversation today has revolved around the importance of planning. And Sarah brought up an interesting point. She mentioned kind of there's a fine line between planning and then analysis paralysis, right? So I got me to thinking, we've talked about project governance, building the guardrails for your business plan, figuring out how to stay on track from the get-go. But as we all know, I mean, life throws curveballs at us. And just like life, I mean, a transformation is going to also throw some different things into the mix that maybe you didn't consider from the beginning in your planning stages. Do you stay married to your plan, and at what point would you adopt? In what scenarios would it be a good idea to deviate from your original plan if you find yourself in that position in the first place?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'd say the easiest way to answer that is to look at the trade-offs you're making. I think a lot of times companies think, no, we can't deviate from the plan because we don't have more time or more cost. We can't afford the extra time and cost. But what they don't look at is, yes, there is a time and cost implication of deviating or potentially delaying a project or going off the original script or plan. But you have to look at, well, what are the consequences if we don't? Is there going to be a material impact to our business? Is it going to affect our operations? And you asked that question earlier about the opportunity cost and profitability impact of messing up a transformation. And those costs and those risks are most of the time a lot higher than the cost or risk of adding more time or more money to the project. Now, you don't want to go overboard and just, you have to recognize you're going down a slippery slope once you deviate, once you add to your budget or add to your timeline or whatever. And you want to be aggressive in how you time it, but you don't want to be so aggressive and so inflexible that you end up creating more problems that cost you more later on.
Right. That makes sense too. It's being kind of going with the flow, right? Sticking to your guns, but going with the flow in the sense that, some things may come up that might be a better idea than you initially thought, and could, be the better route. So it makes sense to be flexible in that sense. Another, commonality I'm seeing across all three of our interviews today is the idea around how important the people are, right? We talk about digital transformation. We talk about, it's about the software, it's about the digital side, but really it's not. It comes down to the people that are behind it, and really specifically organizational change management. I think that's, again, the common theme, and it's the absolutely most important side of carrying out your implementation and having your team adopt the change, right, in a good way. So that kind of leads me into a question that you posed on LinkedIn recently, and we can kind of dive into that, because I think OCM, it's a hot topic. It's an important topic, just like all three of our speakers were talking about today. It's such a pivotal aspect of your digital transformation that if it's overlooked or, underserved, it could carry the power of leading you to an ERP failure. So one question that you posed is, we find that some clients don't like the term organizational change, and they prefer to call it people readiness, workforce transition, organizational readiness, or something completely different. And I loved Hermit John's perspective on the landscape that the world is in right now. Everyone is feeling a sense of change fatigue, with everything that we dealt with in 2020, both personally, professionally, how you're working, how you're delivering your work, just literally everything changed. So could this be, putting lipstick on a pig if you use a different word for it and don't use the word change? Does it really make a difference in your mind, Eric?
That's a tough question. It's yes and no, I suppose. I mean, on one hand, no, it doesn't really change the fact that you're still changing and you're still asking people, or in some cases forcing people, to do things differently and to be outside the comfort zone. But on the other hand, perception is reality. And if people are freaked out by the word change and transformation or whatever it is, then call it something different, I suppose. But at the end of the day, you're doing the same thing. It's just a interesting perspective, because we actually have a client. It's a large client of ours. It's been a client of ours since day one of starting Third Stage. They're actually a client of mine and our teams previous to even starting Third Stage, and they have the same thing. They hate the word change management. They despise it. Like when you say it, and I still am guilty occasionally of letting it slip out around them, and they still just kind of cringe. It's like nails on a chalkboard when they hear it. And whatever, that's the way they are, and they operate a lot better when we don't call it change management, and that's fine. But for other companies, they call it what you want. The fact is your organization is resistant to change, or whatever you want to call it, and we've got to get to the root cause of why that is, rather than just renaming it. Let's figure out why people are resisting the change. That's typically more commonly the answer that I'd give to that.
Right. And Stephen Lizette said it best. It's an interesting discussion on how many ways you can say change without saying change.
Right.
I thought that was funny. But another name for it, organizational alignment. That's from Andre Kummerlangi. I hope I'm saying his name correctly, but organizational alignment. I mean, it's practically the same thing, but you're just getting everybody on the same page rather than changing, right?
Yeah. Well, and just thinking like the client I was just talking about that hates the word change, they also hate the concept of centralization. So they're a company that's gone out and acquired a bunch of companies, and they take pride in the fact that they operate somewhat independently, and they've each got their secret sauce, and they largely let them run independently, and they're not a command and control sort of, we're going to acquire a company, tell you what to do type of company. But the word alignment would freak them out too, because when they hear alignment, they hear, oh, that's corporate telling us the way we're going to align with the way they want us to do business. So I think at the end of the day, if you're an organization that's resistant to change, or you have people that resist to change, they're smart enough to figure out what you're really saying if you change the words. That's probably the easiest answer I could give.
It's true. I mean, and it really does come down to, call it what you want, but the strategy is, really what matters, right? There's so many different, organizational change strategies, I guess, if we can call it that, or whatever you want to call it, that you can implement. And that's really the driver behind a transformation. You can, we can obviously save those strategies for a different conversation down the line. But for our listeners, if you guys want to dive into those specific strategies, I mean, whether it be on Eric's LinkedIn profile, his YouTube channel, the Third Stage LinkedIn profile, our YouTube channel, really there's so many pieces of content with tangible strategies that you can take and implement into your organization, whether that be specific to change management and making sure your people are all on the same page and pushing a project the right direction, or if it's, what should I exactly be focusing on in the planning phases of my transformation. There is content on probably any question you might have when it comes to digital transformation. So definitely recommend you guys look on YouTube, on LinkedIn, really just Google Third Stage and you'll find our content scattered across the internet.
Yeah, that's well put, and a good place to leave it for more information about change management and transformation in general, whatever the case may be, strategy, all the stuff we talked about today. We've got content out there in addition to this podcast. One other thing we do too that you've been instrumental in helping us launch is the monthly Full Throttle workshop series. So that's a workshop we do once a month. It's a paid workshop, but it's more of a deeper dive. It's a small group setting with clients and other peers that are going through transformations. We cover a variety of different topics every month. So something else to be looking for if you like this content we're talking about here. This is a great opportunity to take it to the next level and dive a little bit deeper.
That's right.
All right. Well, thank you again, Paresa, for another good episode. Thank you to our guests for providing such great content. And thank you all, most importantly, for listening and watching here today. Be sure to share this podcast with a friend, a colleague, with your team. We'd love to get the word out. It's a relatively new podcast still, and I think there's a big void in the market for content like this. So we'd love it if you could do us a favor and share the knowledge, share it with a friend, and get other people to join in. Again, we go live on YouTube every Wednesday morning U.S. time, which is 10 a.m. U.S. Eastern time in New York, 3 p.m. in London, and 11 p.m. in Hong Kong. At those times, that's when we go live on YouTube. You can interact with us live, all that good stuff. And of course, if you missed the live recording, you can also listen to it after the fact on our YouTube channel, which if you search Eric Kimberling in Third Stage on YouTube, you'll find us there. So thank you all for joining, and hope you have a great day, and we'll see you next week. Take care.